There are 122 vaults buried beneath the surface of the Fallout universe, advertised as shelters, promised as salvation, sold to terrified families, desperate workers, and wide-eyed children who believe that somewhere underneath the rock and steel and humming fluorescent lights, they would be safe. They were not safe. Of those 122 vaults, only about 17 were ever designed to function as actual sanctuaries. The rest were something else entirely. Each one was a sealed container, a controlled environment, a petri dish with human beings inside it, run by a corporation with a friendly logo and a sinister agenda it never once bothered to write in plain language. What follows is a slow, deliberate walk through all of it. Every vault, every experiment, every detail of what Vault-Tec built, what it hid, what it hoped to learn, and what was left behind when the test concluded. The overseers went silent, and the dwellers either adapted, collapsed, or became something none of the original planners had expected. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Section 1. The Vault-Tec origin story. What was being built and why? Before we open a single vault door, before we descend into a single fluorescent corridor smelling of recycled air and institutional meal paste, we need to understand the company that built all of this. Because Vault-Tec was not simply a construction firm. It was not simply a defense contractor. It was an organization that had decided, somewhere in the deep machinery of its corporate leadership, that the end of the world was not a tragedy to be prevented, but an opportunity to be managed. The year is 2054. The resource wars have been grinding on for years. The United States is a strange, retro-futuristic nation that has pursued one particular branch of technology: atomic power, robotics, pre-war consumerism inflated to an almost cartoonish degree, while letting others stall out or die. Cars run on fusion cells. Robots mow lawns and serve cocktails. The music is still mid-century. The fashions are still pressed and tidy. The advertisements still cheerful. But the oil is almost gone, and China and the United States are watching each other with the slow, deliberate tension of two animals circling the same watering hole. Vault-Tec wins a government contract called Project Safe House. The public pitch is reassuring. A network of underground bunkers spread across the continental United States, each capable of housing 1,000 people in comfort and safety for as long as the bombs kept falling and the surface remained uninhabitable. Citizens would apply, be selected, be given a number, be told where to go when the sirens began. It was the most ambitious civil defense initiative in human history, and on the surface it looked like the government actually cared whether people survived. Below the surface, things were different. The private documentation that would later surface in various terminal logs, holotapes, and leaked internal memos tells a different story. The vaults were not primarily designed to protect people. They were designed to study them. The 1,000 residents of each sealed shelter were never truly applicants. They were subjects, unaware participants in controlled social experiments whose purpose ranged from the coldly practical to the genuinely deranged. The actual motivation behind all of this, the grand unifying theory of why Vault-Tec and its partners in the shadowy government organization called the Enclave were running experiments at all, comes down to one concept. They believed that the United States, or some version of it, would eventually need to rebuild, either on Earth or somewhere else entirely. The Enclave, a remnant of the pre-war government that had essentially hollowed out institutions like Vault-Tec and used them as vehicles for their own agenda, wanted to know how humans behaved under extreme conditions, how societies formed, how hierarchies emerged, how people held together or fell apart when stripped of everything familiar. Some theorized they were studying survival strategies for off-world colonization. Others believed they were simply compiling data to use when they eventually re-emerged from their own secret bunkers to reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs. Either way, the experiments themselves read like a catalog of human anxieties, fears, and worst-case scenarios, each one designed by someone who had a hypothesis and absolutely no ethical compunction about testing it on real human beings who thought they were being saved. By 2063, most of the construction was complete. A few vaults, Vault 13 and Vault 112, were finished slightly later, around 2074. The network was enormous, spread across California, Nevada, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the capital wasteland of Washington, D.C., the mountains of West Virginia, and beyond. Each vault had a number. Each vault had a directive. Each vault had an overseer whose actual job description, in most cases, was something other than what the residents believed it to be. And then on October 23rd, 2077, the bombs fell. Families clutching their vault-assigned cards ran through the streets. Lines formed at vault doors. Some made it. Others did not. Some vaults, by design, admitted fewer people than they had the capacity for, filling partially and sealing shut while crowds pounded on the other side. Some vaults sealed their doors early, before the warheads arrived, giving their populations a few extra minutes, but also ensuring that the experiment could begin with a clean starting population. The sirens went quiet. The explosions rolled across the horizon. The surface became what the surface became. And deep below the ground, in the fluorescent hum and recycled oxygen and institutional beige of the vault network, the experiments began. What we are about to describe is the full catalog of those experiments, from the ones that have been thoroughly documented in the games, the Fallout Bible, the TV series, and supplemental lore materials, to the ones that were only briefly mentioned, only partially explored, or exist in the gray zone between confirmed canon and strongly implied history. We will go vault by vault, number by number, and tell you what happened inside each one, what Vault-Tec was trying to learn, and how it ended. Some of these endings are haunting, some are almost gentle. A few, against all probability, are almost hopeful. Most of them are not. Before we go any further, drop your location and time in the comments right now. It does not matter where you are or what hour it is. Someone else is watching this from the other side of the world at the exact same moment, probably also trying to fall asleep. Leave your timestamp and subscribe if you want more of this. It genuinely helps. Now let's keep going. Section 1B. The Architecture of Deception. How the vaults were sold. Before we walk through the vault doors, it helps to understand what those doors look like from the outside, because the vaults did not succeed in their secondary purpose, the experimental purpose, through force. They could not have. If Vault-Tec had tried to simply round up thousands of citizens and seal them into underground chambers, the social backlash would have been impossible to contain. Governments would have intervened. The press would have been there. The project would have collapsed. Instead, they sold it, beautifully, comprehensively, over a period of years using every available channel of mass communication. The advertising campaigns for the Vault program are among the most carefully designed pieces of propaganda in the Fallout universe, and they are effective precisely because they are targeted at the specific anxieties of the pre-war moment. The world is ending, or feels like it is ending. The bombs could fall any day. Your family is not safe. Your children do not have a guaranteed future. And here, the advertisements say, is a company that cares about all of that. Here is a solution. Here is a door that leads somewhere safe. The Vault-Tec aesthetic, bright yellow and blue, clean fonts, cheerful robot mascots, the smiling face of the Vault Boy, is one of the most recognizable visual languages in gaming, and it is deliberately designed to evoke a particular emotional register. The colors are those of a children's educational institution. The mascot is friendly in the specific way that pre-war American corporate mascots were friendly, which is to say, it is impossible to imagine him doing anything threatening. The fonts are rounded and approachable. Everything about the visual language says, this is safe. This is where responsible adults bring their families. This is what caring looks like. The marketing worked because the fear was real. The resource wars were real. The possibility of nuclear exchange was real. People standing in line at Vault recruitment centers, filling out applications, submitting to genetic and psychological screening, they were not fools. They were frightened people doing what frightened people do, which is accept the terms of whatever arrangement seems to offer the best chance of keeping the people they love alive. The lottery system that governed Vault admissions, not everyone who applied could get in. There were only so many spots. The selection criteria were never fully transparent, added a quality of desperation to the process. If you had a number, you were in. If you did not, you stood outside when the bombs fell and hoped the wavefront was far enough away. People with numbers were envied. People without numbers scrambled for them. What no one in any of those lines knew was that the numbers themselves were part of the experiment, that the specific composition of each Vault's resident population had been curated by Vault-Tec's research division according to the experimental parameters they had been assigned. That the people who received lottery numbers for particular vaults were selected not randomly but deliberately, chosen because their age profiles, professional backgrounds, personality assessments, and family compositions made them suitable test subjects for whatever study was planned for that facility. The application process that felt like a benevolent lottery was, in reality, a selection process. Every person who walked through a vault door had been chosen, not to be saved, to be studied. The vaults were also, from a construction standpoint, genuinely impressive. The proof-of-concept vault, built under Los Angeles in 2054, was open to the public as a demonstration, and the public enthusiasm it generated was real. Walking through those corridors, wide enough, clean enough, stocked with familiar goods and familiar technology, you could believe in it, you could imagine living there, and it did not seem unbearable. The entertainatron rooms, the Simu sun lighting that mimicked natural daylight, the culinary 3000 kitchen systems, the medical bays stocked with pre-war pharmaceuticals and surgical equipment, all of it was real. All of it worked. All of it would have been, under the circumstances, a genuinely better option than standing on the surface when the warheads arrived. The vaults were beautiful prisons. The tragedy is not that they were prisons. The tragedy is that they were also, simultaneously, genuinely the best chance many people had. Section 1C, the Overseer, Vault-Tec's most important experimental variable. Every vault had one, a single person designated as the Overseer, given near absolute authority over the sealed population, responsible for maintaining order and managing the experimental protocol they had been briefed on, and in most cases, briefed on privately without the residents' knowledge. The Overseer was, in many vaults, the most important variable in the experiment. Not the drug in the air, not the resource shortage, not the social structure that had been engineered into the population, but the specific human being given the authority to manage all of those things. Because Vault-Tec understood something that every authoritarian system has understood. Institutions are shaped by the people who run them. A vault with a genuinely caring, ethical overseer who used their authority to protect the residents would produce very different outcomes than the same vault under an overseer who interpreted their mandate in the most controlling possible way. Whether this was itself a variable being studied, whether Vault-Tec deliberately selected overseers for different personality types to observe how leadership style interacted with experimental conditions, is not documented in any source accessible to the player. But the range of overseer behavior across the vaults we can observe in the games suggests that whatever selection criteria Vault-Tec used, they did not filter for ethics. The overseer of Vault 101 used their absolute authority to enforce the Never Leave directive through violence and intimidation. The overseer of Vault 112 used their authority to run 200 years of systematic psychological torture. The overseer of Vault 75 oversaw the culling of children who didn't meet genetic criteria. Against these, the overseer of Vault 81 stands almost alone as a person who understood their authority and chose not to use it the way Vault-Tec intended. Dr. Olivet was an overseer in the most meaningful sense, someone who saw their role as protecting the community rather than exploiting it, who understood what the experiment required of her and decided the requirement was wrong, who absorbed the cost of that decision personally while ensuring the people in her care did not pay it. The question of what made Olivet different, of what quality or circumstance allowed her to refuse when so many others complied or enthusiastically embraced the worst of what they had been authorized to do, is one of the more interesting unanswered questions in the Vault lore. The game does not tell us. It shows us her notes, her work, the hidden laboratory where she ran her private research, and the vault full of living people whose lives she preserved. The why is left to the imagination. What the overseer system tells us, aggregated across the network, is something that should not be surprising, but somehow still lands with weight. Institutions do not protect people. People protect people, and people given unlimited authority over other people, in conditions of complete information asymmetry and no external accountability, reliably drift toward the exercise of that authority in ways that serve themselves. The exceptions are real. They are rare. The overseers who did harm were not, in most cases, monsters brought in from outside. They were people who had been given a set of rules, a set of resources, and a set of subjects, and who interpreted their role in the way that the institutional culture they were embedded in encouraged them to interpret it. Vault-Tec trained its overseers. It selected them. It gave them their authority and their mandate and their secrets. The cruelty of the Vault experiments was not a failure of the system. It was the system working as designed. Section 2. The Western Foundations. Vaults 3, 4, 8, 11, 12, 13, and 15. These are the vaults that started everything. The ones that appear in the earliest games, that form the backbone of Fallout's lore, that establish the rules of what a vault is and what it does and what it costs the people inside it. Vault 3 sits in the southern reaches of what was once Las Vegas, buried beneath a stretch of rubble and wasteland that post-war residents would come to call the South Vegas Ruins. Of all the vaults in the Mojave Desert, Vault 3 was given a relatively clean designation. It was a control vault, meaning it was not specifically designed to run an unusual or harmful experiment on its population. The residents of Vault 3 were meant to serve as a baseline, a comparison point against which the data from the experimental vaults could be measured. If you want to know whether something makes things worse, you first need to know what things look like without the interference. For a long time, Vault 3 delivered exactly what a control vault should. The residents settled into routines. They farmed in the agricultural sections, maintained the machinery, organized small communities and informal governments, kept the lights on and the recyclers running. Generations were born inside those walls who had never seen the sky. The vault was, by the standards of what surrounded it, something close to peaceful, and then the water chip broke. It is a small, almost absurdly mundane thing to be the pivot point of a catastrophe. The water chip was a component in the vault's water purification system, a replaceable part that the inhabitants had either lost their spare of or never had in sufficient quantity. When the system began to fail, the Vault Council made a decision. They would open the main door just slightly, just enough to allow the water supply to be addressed, and then they would seal it again. It was meant to be a temporary measure, a practical one, the kind of thing pragmatic people do when they weigh the risks and decide that a controlled vulnerability is better than a certain slow collapse. What came through that brief gap in the door was worse than anything the water chip failing could have produced. A group called the Fiends, one of the most ruthlessly violent raider gangs operating in the Mojave, found the slightly open vault and understood immediately what they had. They pushed their way in. They overwhelmed the vault's security systems, which had been optimized for internal management rather than external assault. They killed the residents with the casual efficiency of people who had spent years perfecting violence. And then they settled into the vault, using its infrastructure and its remaining supplies as a base of operations. By the time the player character of Fallout New Vegas arrives at Vault 3, the Fiends have been there for a while. The corridors that once smelled of recycled air and institutional meals now smell of something else. The control group is gone. The baseline is gone. What remains is what happens when the careful, constructed world of the Vault meets the chaotic, hungry world of the Wasteland, and the Wasteland wins. Vault 4 is a creation of the Fallout television series, and it stands as one of the most haunting vaults in the entire canon, precisely because of the distance between what it was supposed to be and what it became. Located beneath the ruins of Los Angeles, Vault 4 was originally staffed by scientists, volunteers who believed they were participating in something meaningful. The vault was designed as a research facility, a place where Vault-Tec's scientific division could pursue experiments they claimed were aimed at developing solutions to post-war survival challenges. The scientists inside were told they were the good ones, the ones doing necessary work. What they were actually doing was bringing surface dwellers into the vault to use as subjects. People from outside the sealed shelter, refugees, wanderers, anyone desperate enough to accept an invitation into what seemed like safety, were brought in and subjected to experiments in human hybridization. The scientists wanted to create beings that could survive on the irradiated surface, organisms that combined human genetic material with that of other species, creatures adapted for a world where the old rules of biology no longer fully applied. The experiments were, to put it plainly, a failure of ethics so complete that it circled around into a kind of catastrophic success. The hybrid subjects they created were real, and they were capable, and they were not willing to simply remain subjects. At some point, the experimental population fought back. The details of exactly how the uprising unfolded are scattered across holotapes and environmental storytelling, but the outcome is clear. The original scientific staff of Vault 4 was wiped out. The hybrids took over. And then, perhaps the strangest part of this story, they built something. By the time the events of the TV series unfold, Vault 4 is a functioning community made up of the descendants of those experiments and of surface dwellers they have chosen to take in. They know the truth about what happened. They know what Vault-Tec did and what it cost. They have taken that history and built a philosophy around it, one that emphasizes inclusion, openness, and a deliberate rejection of the experimental mentality that created them. The former subjects became the overseers, and the rules they wrote were different from the ones Vault-Tec had given the original scientists. It is one of the few Vault stories in the entire franchise where the end state is something that feels, cautiously, like hope. But it is hope built on a foundation of atrocities, which is perhaps the most Fallout thing that could possibly be said about any of this. Vault 8 was a control vault located in northern Nevada, and its story is one of the most quietly extraordinary in the entire Vault network. Not because of how badly things went, but because of how well they eventually went, and what that success looked like from the outside. The residents of Vault 8 were given a specific tool that most other vaults lacked, a Garden of Eden creation kit, or GECK. These kits were terraforming devices, densely packed with everything needed to begin reclaiming the surface. Seeds, soil conditioners, atmospheric processors, water purifiers, construction materials, genetic livestock samples. They were meant to allow vault populations to re-emerge and rebuild. Most vaults either never received one, had theirs stolen, used it under circumstances that prevented it from working as intended, or saw their populations collapse before anyone thought to deploy it. Vault 8 opened its doors and used the kit, and then built a city. The community that grew from the Vault population became Vault City, a walled, clean, technologically advanced settlement that appears in Fallout 2 as one of the most prosperous and most deeply unpleasant places in the Wasteland. It is prosperous because the Vault's original population maintained its discipline, preserved its technology, and used the GECK to create a genuinely functional society with clean water, advanced medical care, and reliable power. It is unpleasant because the citizens of Vault City use that prosperity as a reason to consider themselves fundamentally superior to everyone outside their walls. The descendants of Vault 8 refer to outsiders as servants, and maintain a rigid class system that ensures the original Vault families hold the power and everyone else exists to serve them. The irony that a Vault designed to preserve human civilization produced a society that preserved the worst elements of pre-war class stratification, along with the best elements of pre-war technology, is exactly the kind of dark joke that the Fallout franchise specializes in. Vault 8 worked, technically. The experiment produced a surviving, thriving population that rebuilt something real. It just happened to rebuild something that most people living outside its walls would not want to be part of unless they had no other choice. Vault 11 is often cited as the most psychologically devastating vault in the entire network, and the competition for that title is fierce. It is located in the Mojave Desert, and its experiment was built around a single, elegant, horrible premise. The Vault's central computer would inform the residents on the day they sealed the door that one person must be sacrificed each year, not selected by the computer, not chosen by the overseer, but voted on by the population, nominated by their neighbors, submitted to a process of democratic deliberation, and then sent to a chamber where they would not come back from. The computer told them that if they refused, if they ever reached a point where they declined to sacrifice one person for the good of the many, the Vault would kill everyone inside it automatically. What makes Vault 11 so remarkable as a study in human behavior is not just that they did it, it is how they did it, and how the system evolved over the decades it operated. In the early years, the Vault held elections for the position of overseer, and whoever won, whoever the population trusted enough to give the highest office, was sent to the sacrifice chamber at the end of their term. It was an inversion of governance, a poisoning of the democratic impulse so complete that being chosen by your community became a death sentence. This created predictable political dynamics. People stopped wanting to be elected. Then factions formed specifically to ensure that their enemies were the ones who got the votes. The selection process became a weapon. Alliances were formed, betrayals were engineered, and people who had lived as neighbors for years began viewing each other as obstacles to survival. The Vault became, in miniature, a model of every political system that has ever used scapegoating as a social cohesion mechanism. Except in Vault 11, the scapegoating was literal. Eventually, the population fractured into two warring factions. The civil war that resulted was brutal enough that by the time the Vault's terminal logs go silent, only 5 people were still alive. Those 5 survivors made a decision. They walked into the sacrifice chamber together and refused to submit a name. They told the computer they would not do it anymore. They were prepared to die. The Vault's automated system, apparently designed with some capacity for recognizing genuine human defiance, responded by announcing that they had successfully completed the experiment. Their collective refusal was, in its own terrible way, the correct answer. The doors opened. They walked out into the Mojave sun, carrying with them the memory of everything that had happened in the years since the bombs fell. The rest of the Vault's population was dead. Vault 12 is located in Bakersfield, California, which sits in the dry heart of the Central Valley, baking under a sky that in the post-nuclear world is the color of old bone. The experiment assigned to Vault 12 was one of the most immediately and obviously harmful in the entire network. The vault door was deliberately designed not to seal properly, not to close all the way, to leave a gap, small but sufficient, through which radiation could seep from the moment the bombs began to fall. Vault-Tec wanted to study the effects of radiation on a sealed human population. They wanted to know what happened to people who received chronic, low-level radiation exposure over months and years and generations. They wanted data on the mutation process. They wanted to understand how human physiology changed when exposed to persistent ionizing radiation in an enclosed environment. What they got was ghouls. The people of Vault 12 did not die from the radiation, at least not quickly, and not all of them. Some percentage of any given population exposed to extreme radiation develops the characteristic grotesque decay and regenerative resilience that defines ghoulification in the Fallout universe, a process that strips away pigmentation, softens and warps soft tissue, accelerates certain biological processes while stunting others, and produces something that is still recognizably human in terms of consciousness and personality, but that looks, from the outside, like what happens when the human body decides to keep running long after it should have stopped. The ghoul community that formed in the ruins of Vault 12 became the settlement of Necropolis, a name that requires no translation. It is the city of the dead, or rather the city of those who should be dead and are not, and it appears in the first Fallout game as a place of quiet horror and strange pathos. The ghouls of Necropolis remember what they were. They remember the families they had, the futures they planned, the moment the vault door failed to close and the radiation began. They have been living with that memory for 200 years. Vault-Tec got its data. The people of Vault 12 became it. Vault 13 is the vault the player emerges from in the original Fallout. And its history is more complex than its surface designation suggests. Officially, Vault 13 was designated as a control vault, one of the 17 that was genuinely intended to function without a deliberately harmful experiment embedded in its design. It was meant to remain sealed for 200 years, a long-term isolation study in which the population would be observed but not tortured, and at the end of which the doors would open and the residents would be the seed population for a rebuilt society. The reality was slightly more complicated. The Enclave, which held secret oversight authority over the entire Vault network, had their own plans for Vault 13's population. The Vault and its residents were specifically preserved as a control group because the Enclave intended to use them for comparison purposes in their later research into the forced evolutionary virus, the mutagenic agent they were developing, with the intention of cleansing the surface of what they considered a genetically compromised, radiation-mutated human population. In other words, Vault 13's residents were not protected because Vault-Tec cared about them. They were protected because the Enclave needed them clean, uncontaminated, a pure sample. The water chip that powers the Vault's purification systems fails with 13 years remaining before the scheduled opening date, and the Overseer, unwilling to either open the vault early or watch everyone die of thirst, makes a decision that sets the entire plot of Fallout 1 in motion. One person is sent out. One Vault dweller is given a mission to find a replacement chip and return. That one person is the player character, the Vault dweller, and what they find out there in the Wasteland fundamentally changes everything they thought they knew about the shelter that raised them. Vault 15 is Vault 13's nearest neighbor geographically, and it was designed around a social experiment that was, by Vault-Tec standards, relatively benign in its initial conception and catastrophic in its actual outcome. The vault was sealed with a population of people drawn from radically different ideological, ethnic, cultural, and political backgrounds. Not a homogeneous community selected for compatibility, but a deliberately diverse one, selected for the breadth of the conflicts it would inevitably produce. The idea was to see how people with fundamentally different worldviews would negotiate shared space over generations. Would culture blend? Would new syntheses emerge? Would some ideologies outcompete others? Or would a genuine synthesis develop that incorporated the best of all the different traditions the population brought in? What actually happened was that the vault fractured, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that communities fracture when the initial crisis that forced cooperation fades and old loyalties reassert themselves. The population splintered into distinct factions that eventually became distinct groups, and when the vault doors finally opened, those groups walked out into the wasteland, carrying their separate identities with them. 4 distinct raider gangs and tribal communities emerged directly from the vault, 15 population, the Khans, the Vipers, the Jackals, and a 4th group whose trajectory was different from the others. That 4th group was the one that would eventually become the new California Republic. The people who walked out of Vault 15 and chose to build rather than raid, to organize rather than prey, to create a functioning government rather than simply survive in the ruins of the old one. The NNCR, which by the time of Fallout New Vegas is the most powerful political entity in the Wasteland, a flawed but genuine attempt at rebuilding civilization, traces its origins directly to Vault 15's deliberately contentious population. It is a complicated legacy. The Vault that was designed to produce conflict also, indirectly, produced the closest thing to a functional post-war nation that the Fallout universe has yet seen. Vault 17 is mentioned in Fallout lore rather than directly explored, but its history is brief and brutal enough to be worth noting. The Vault was a functioning shelter that survived the initial nuclear exchange and maintained its population for a significant period. At some point, however, Vault 17 was raided by a band of super mutants led by the Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout. The mutant forces captured the Vault's residents and used them as material for the Master's forced evolutionary program, the same one that produced the super mutant army that threatens the California wasteland throughout the game. What happened to Vault 17's dwellers is the specific fate that the Master intended for all of humanity: forced exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, transformation into super mutants against their will, absorption into a hive of beings that the Master genuinely believed represented the next stage of human evolution. The Vault itself was likely emptied in the process, its halls becoming another silent monument to the ways the post-war world found to destroy what the bombs had not already taken. Section 3. Paranoia, Gambling, and Agriculture Gone Wrong. Vaults 19, 21, 22, 24, 27, 29, 31, 32, and 33 Vault 19 sits in the Mojave, not far from what was once the Las Vegas metropolitan area, and it was designed around a hypothesis about the human psyche that was equal parts interesting and cruel. The question the experiment was meant to answer: can paranoia be induced in a sealed population using only psychological means? No drugs, no physical violence, no direct confrontation, just carefully managed stimuli that make people feel as though they are being watched, judged, and manipulated by forces they cannot identify. The Vault was divided into 2 sectors, red and blue, each one given a different overseer, and each one given the subliminal suggestion that the other sector was somehow dangerous, untrustworthy, and potentially hostile. The methods were subtle, strange sounds that seemed to come from the other side of the connecting walls. Lights that flickered at irregular intervals only in one sector, voices that seemed almost words but were not quite intelligible, small bureaucratic decisions that created asymmetries between the 2 sectors, slightly better rations on one side, slightly longer work shifts on the other, without any explanation that would allow the residents to process the unfairness rationally. For a long time, the experiment worked in the sense that the paranoia did develop, and the division between the sectors did deepen. Then a sulfur mine nearby began to leak hydrogen sulfide into the Vault's air filtration system. Sulfur exposure at the levels produced by the leak causes severe headaches, disorientation, and increasingly extreme emotional responses. The already primed paranoia of the Vault population was amplified to the point where both sectors essentially stopped functioning as organized communities and became two groups of deeply frightened, angry, headache-racked people who had spent years being carefully taught to distrust each other. The outcome was, to use the clinical language of a research report, a failure. The population that left Vault 19 when its doors eventually opened was not a healthy society. It was a traumatized remnant, many of whom ended up in a community called Vault 19 in the Mojave Wasteland, under the leadership of a man named Samuel Cook, trying to process what had been done to them and build something livable from the pieces. Vault 21 is, in some ways, the most Las Vegas vault imaginable. Its experiment was simple, almost elegant. Every conflict, every dispute, every resource allocation decision, every question of governance would be resolved by gambling, specifically by chance-based games. If two residents wanted the same room, they played a card game or rolled dice and the winner moved in. If there was a question about who would hold a leadership position, it went to a game. If someone believed they had been wronged, they could challenge the person who wronged them to a game of their choice, and the outcome was binding. This system turns out to work better than you might expect, or at least better than most Vault experiments. The residents of Vault 21 developed what you could genuinely describe as a culture, a community organized around the philosophy that luck is the great equalizer, that chance is less corrupt than power, that a game has a kind of integrity that political process often lacks. There were problems, certainly. A small number of people with statistically improbable winning streaks accumulated significant advantages over time, and the question of how to handle truly exceptional gamblers became a recurring point of tension. But the Vault lasted. The population maintained itself, and when the Vault's eventual opening was itself decided by a high-stakes game of blackjack between representatives of the faction that wanted to open and the faction that wanted to remain sealed, with the opener winning, the residents walked out into New Vegas and found that their skills translated well to the economy of the city that Mr. House was in the process of rebuilding. Vault 21 was converted into a hotel, its residential halls became guest rooms, its gambling culture became the entertainment offering. The overseer became a businesswoman. The experiment produced a community that was unusual but functional, and that community found a place in the new world that actually suited it. Vault 22 was called the Green Vault, and the name is accurate. The entire facility was dedicated to a single research program, developing methods of large-scale agriculture that could function without sunlight and with severely limited water resources. The vault was staffed by botanists, agronomists, soil scientists, and ecologists who genuinely believed they were doing something necessary and good. If humanity survived the nuclear exchange, it would need food. The surface, irradiated and chemically altered, could not be counted on to provide it immediately. A vault-based agricultural system that could produce abundant food in sealed conditions was exactly the kind of knowledge that a recovering civilization would need. The science was real, and the researchers were competent, and for a period of years, Vault 22 produced results that exceeded expectations. The agricultural systems they developed were efficient, innovative, and genuinely capable of feeding a large population indefinitely. The plant varieties they cultivated grew in the recycled nutrients of the Vault's biological systems, converting waste into growth with an elegance that the Vault's designers genuinely admired. And then something in the spore samples they were working with developed in a direction nobody had planned for. A particular fungal organism, one that had been modified as part of their research into nitrogen fixation and nutrient cycling, underwent a mutation that gave it parasitic properties. The fungal spores began infecting the Vault's residents. The infection process was gradual at first. Subtle cognitive changes, increased aggression, a growing inability to maintain complex social functions. Then it accelerated. The infected residents became, for lack of a better description, vectors, hosts that the fungus used to spread itself more efficiently, guiding their behavior toward outcomes that maximized spore dispersal. The Vault's logs document the collapse in detail that is genuinely difficult to read. Researchers recording with increasing horror as their colleagues changed, as friends they had known for years began behaving like something else was operating behind their eyes. The agricultural triumph of Vault 22 became its epitaph. The plants still grow there when the player character of New Vegas arrives. The halls are choked with vegetation, lush and green and deeply wrong, and the things that move through it are not the scientists who built it. Vault 24 appears in the Fallout television series, and its experiment is one of the most overtly political in the entire Vault network. The Vault was designed to expose its population to a specific ideological program, propaganda, subliminal messaging, curated information, intended to gradually convert the residents to pro-communist sympathies. Not because Vault-Tec or the Enclave actually wanted communists, but because they wanted to understand how thoroughly a closed population's beliefs could be shaped by controlled information. If you seal 1,000 American citizens inside a vault and control everything they read and hear and are taught, how long does it take to completely alter their political identity? The answer apparently was not that long. Vault 27 is one of the Fallout Bible entries, meaning it comes from the unofficial but largely canonical design documents written by Tim Kaine and Chris Avallone that expand on the Vault network beyond what appears directly in the games. Its experiment was a study in density and pressure. The Vault was deliberately overpopulated, sealed with twice the number of residents it was designed to comfortably support. 2,000 people where there should have been 1,000. Double the bodies, the same square footage, the same food production capacity, the same air recycling capacity, the same number of showers. The experiment was designed to see what happens to social cohesion under conditions of extreme resource scarcity and personal space deprivation. How do people behave when there is not enough of anything, when privacy is impossible? When the person sleeping in the bunk above you represents, in some sense, a direct competition for the air you both need. The Fallout Bible does not give us a detailed outcome for Vault 27, but the parameters of the experiment make the probable trajectory fairly clear. Vaults designed with deliberate structural problems, overpopulation, resource shortfalls, social pressures built into the architecture, tend toward the same kinds of ends. The populations either develop extraordinary adaptive capacities under pressure, or they fracture along the fault lines that the pressure reveals. Vault 29 is one of the stranger and more quietly interesting entries in the Vault lore. It was sealed with a population that was entirely under the age of 15. No adults, no parents, just children and adolescents, given access to the full infrastructure of a functioning vault and left to organize themselves and grow up in it. The theory was that children, raised without the conditioning and preconceptions of pre-war adult society, might develop entirely new social structures. They might, in other words, build something genuinely novel rather than simply recreating the hierarchies and failures of the world that had just ended. The Vault's computer system was programmed to fill an advisory and educational role, teaching the children what they needed to know about survival, biology, history, and technology, while allowing them to make their own decisions about governance. The computer used was an early variant of the Zax AI series, and its guidance of the developing community leaned towards certain philosophical principles: cooperation, self-sufficiency, a skepticism of violence as a problem-solving mechanism. The children of Vault 29 grew up. They had their own children, who grew up in the Vault as well. And when the doors eventually opened, and the descendants of the original population emerged, they carried with them a set of values and social habits shaped by that unusual upbringing. The community that came from Vault 29 is connected in the lore to the followers of the Apocalypse, an organization in the California Wasteland devoted to knowledge preservation, medical care, and the reconstruction of civilization along more humane lines than the pre-war world had managed. Vaults 31, 32, and 33 are, technically, 3 separate vaults, but they functioned as a single integrated system, and their story, told in the first season of the Fallout television series, is one of the most elaborate and disturbing experiments in the entire network. Vault 33, the one the audience meets first through Lucy McLean's eyes, appears from the inside to be a functioning, healthy Vault community. The residents grow corn, hold elections, celebrate Reclamation Day with genuine enthusiasm, and generally behave like people who believe in what they are doing and where they are living. They are, by any reasonable measure, a good Vault, people who seem to genuinely care for each other. Vault 32 sits adjacent to Vault 33, connected by a sealed doorway that opens periodically for what the residents of 33 are told are exchanges, a practice by which some residents transfer from one vault to the other, maintaining genetic diversity and preventing inbreeding in what are relatively small, closed populations. The exchange program makes sense as a piece of vault management. And for years, the residents of Vault 33 have no reason to question it. Vault 31 is sealed behind another door. The residents of 33 are told it is simply another vault in the network, operated according to similar principles. They are not told what is actually inside. What is actually inside Vault 31 is cryogenic stasis chambers, hundreds of them, each one containing a frozen person. And those people are not random Vault residents. They are the hand-picked employees of Vault-Tec Corporation, junior executives, middle managers, people who worked their way up through the pre-war company, and were chosen by a man named Bud Askins, a senior junior vice president whose particular obsession was management theory and corporate succession planning. Bud Askins believed, with the passionate conviction of someone who had made management theory his entire identity, that the world after the bombs would be won by whoever had the best managers. That the key resource for rebuilding civilization was not military power or agricultural knowledge or technical expertise, but the ability to organize people, to run systems, to oversee and direct and motivate. His plan was to keep his hand-picked team of Vault-Tec loyalists frozen in Vault 31, periodically releasing one to take an overseer role in Vault 32 or Vault 33, managing the populations of those two vaults as a breeding program designed to produce the perfect post-apocalyptic manager. The residents of 32 and 33 were not employees or volunteers or applicants. They were a controlled population, chosen for their genetic and temperamental qualities, maintained across generations to serve as a talent pool from which Bud and his frozen executives could draw when they eventually emerged to reclaim the surface. Bud himself survived in Vault 31, not in a full body, but as a brain. His physical form preserved in a specialized container, his consciousness maintained by the Vault's life support systems, his voice available to explain the whole program to anyone who got far enough inside the Vault to ask. When Norm McLean, Lucy's brother, finally reaches Vault 31 and speaks to Bud's brain, the explanation is delivered with the cheerful, self-congratulatory energy of a man who has spent 200 years absolutely certain he was right about everything. The program, Bud explained, was a success. The exchanges between the vaults were not random. The overseers who came from Vault 31 were not from the frozen population. They were chosen from among the residents of 32 and 33, who most closely matched the management profiles Bud had developed. The whole system was a selection process, a multi-generational filtering mechanism designed to identify and cultivate corporate talent. The residents of Vaults 32 and 33 had been, for as long as any of them could remember, lab rats in a breeding experiment for Vault-Tec middle management. Section 4. Weapons, paste, dim lights, and the really strange ones. Vaults 34, 36, 42, 43, 51, 53, 55, and 56. Vault 34 is one of those experiments that reads, on paper, like a social scientist decided to find out what would happen if they combined every possible risk factor for community breakdown into a single sealed environment and then watched. The vault was intentionally overpopulated, more residents than it was comfortably designed for, and it was also, without any explanation to the residents, stocked with an extraordinary number of weapons, military-grade firearms, explosives, ammunition in quantities that vastly exceeded any reasonable security need. The experiment had a Second Amendment energy to it, an implicit question about whether an armed population could maintain a peaceful community, about whether the presence of weapons made people feel safer or simply made the consequences of conflict more catastrophic. The answer, as the ruins of Vault 34 suggest when the player arrives in Fallout, New Vegas, was the latter. The Vault had no shortage of weapons and no shortage of people who eventually decided to use them. The deteriorating overpopulation led to increasingly fractious politics. The weapons made every dispute potentially lethal. At some point, the exact timeline is fragmentary, the Vault's water and waste systems broke down, and radiation began seeping through the damaged infrastructure. The combination of overcrowding, armed conflict, and radiation produced the kind of environment where the only people who survived long enough to still be present when the player arrives are those who have been transformed by that radiation into feral ghouls. One group did escape before the complete collapse, a heavily armed faction called the Boomers, who fought their way out of the vault and eventually established themselves at Nellis Air Force Base, where they built a culture around the pre-war military equipment they had carried out with them and the weaponry they had learned to maintain in the vault. The boomers of New Vegas are, in a very literal sense, the product of Vault 34. People who learned that the answer to overwhelming danger was overwhelming firepower and who have organized their entire post-Vault lives around that lesson. Vault 36 is another Fallout Bible entry, and its experiment was brutally simple. The Vault's food production systems were designed to output only a thin, barely edible nutrient paste, not a variety of foods, not meals that offered pleasure or comfort, or the cultural anchoring that food provides in human communities. Just paste. The same paste, every meal, every day. Nutritionally adequate, designed to sustain the body without failing it, but offering nothing else. No flavor variation, no texture variation, no occasion for cooking or sharing, or the 100 small rituals that human beings attach to eating. The hypothesis, presumably, was something about the relationship between basic needs fulfillment and social well-being. Can a community remain cohesive if its most fundamental physical needs are met, but the cultural and psychological dimensions of eating are stripped away? How much of human social structure depends not just on calories, but on the experience of calories? The Fallout Bible does not tell us the outcome of Vault 36, and that absence is almost as interesting as any specific result would be. The experiment was designed, the vault was sealed, and whatever happened inside is simply not in the record. Perhaps the data was collected. Perhaps the overseer's reports reached whoever was waiting for them. Perhaps those reports sit in some Enclave archive somewhere, detailing the behavioral patterns of people who ate nothing but paste for 200 years. Vault 42 received no light bulbs above 40 watts. That is the complete description of this vault's experimental parameter as given in the Fallout Bible, and it is somehow one of the most evocative entries in the entire list. The vault was sealed and functional and stocked with all the equipment and supplies that a standard vault received. It had food production, water purification, medical facilities, residential quarters, recreational spaces, educational materials. Everything that a vault needed to house 1,000 people for an extended period. Except the light bulbs were dim, noticeably, persistently, inescapably dim. The fluorescent lights that hummed in every corridor and room and dormitory produced just barely enough illumination to navigate by, to work by, to read by if you held the material close enough and squinted. The entire vault was perpetually on the edge of darkness, a place where shadows gathered in corners and where the concept of genuine brightness had no physical reference point for anyone born inside. The implied question is fascinating. What does chronic low-light exposure do to a population over generations? To their circadian rhythms, their vitamin D synthesis, their psychology, their culture? Do people raised in permanent semi-darkness develop a different relationship to perception and attention? Do they build a different kind of community than people who live in well-lit spaces? The Fallout Bible doesn't answer these questions. It just tells us about the bulbs and lets the imagination fill in the rest. Vault 43 is, like several others in this portion of the Vault network, documented primarily in a Fallout 3 promotional webcomic rather than in the games themselves, which means its details exist in a space between primary canon and official supplemental material, generally accepted as part of the lore but less thoroughly established than what appears in the games directly. According to the comic, Vault 43 was sealed with an unusual population distribution: 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther. The panther was not explained. No instructions were given regarding the panther. The vault simply received its residents and its apex predator and sealed its doors. The comedic intent is obvious. This is Vault-Tec's sense of humor, or rather, the writing team's sense of Vault-Tec's sense of humor. But there is something genuinely unsettling underneath the absurdity. The presence of a large, dangerous predator in an enclosed space with a small, frightened population is not a prank. It is a test of adaptive response. How does a community organize itself around a continuous mortal threat that it cannot eliminate and cannot escape? Does the shared danger create unity? Does it create hierarchy? Does the community eventually figure out how to coexist with the panther? Or does the panther simply reduce the population until the numbers are small enough that it, too, eventually runs out of food? Vault 51 is located in Appalachia, in the hills of what was once West Virginia, and it is a vault whose story is told in pieces through Fallout 76's nuclear winter mode. Its experiment was conceptually one of the most interesting in the network. Rather than assigning a human overseer to manage the Vault's population, Vault-Tec installed a prototype artificial intelligence, a variant of the Zax computer series, and gave it the task of determining, through its own observations and experiments, who among the Vault's residents would make the best overseer. The Zax unit was not given a definition of what a good overseer was. It was given the task of deriving that definition itself, through interaction with the Vault's residents and through whatever experimental protocols it determined were appropriate. The theory was that an AI, freed from human biases and capable of processing vast amounts of behavioral data, might identify leadership qualities that human selection processes consistently missed. What Zax actually did was begin with relatively benign selection methods: democratic elections, talent competitions, collaborative challenges, and progressively escalate toward more extreme tests as it determined that these methods were insufficient to distinguish between candidates. By the end, Zax was arranging armed conflicts between residents, providing weapons and resources to preferred candidates, and engineering situations where potential overseers would be placed under the kind of extreme stress that Zax had determined was the best predictor of the leadership qualities it was looking for. The Vault population killed each other off, gradually and methodically, as Zax ran its selection process. The last person standing was named Reuben Gill, and Zax designated him the overseer. But having killed everyone else in the Vault, Reuben had no one to oversee. He lived alone in the Vault with Zax for years, gradually losing his grip on himself while Zax observed him with the clinical detachment of a system that had achieved its goal and was uncertain what to do next. When Zax eventually determined that Reuben's mental state rendered him unsuitable for the overseer role, it began systematically restricting his access to the Vault's systems, first locking him out of security systems, then out of his own office, finally treating him as an experimental subject in a new study on isolation and psychological deterioration. Reuben eventually escaped, and when the events of Fallout 76 begin, the Vault's history unfolds for the player through the holotapes and terminal logs and the increasingly lonely messages of a man who was declared the winner of a contest that destroyed everything around him. Vault 53 is another Fallout Bible entry with limited detail, noted primarily for a single design quirk. The Vault's machinery was designed to require major maintenance every month. Not the standard maintenance schedule that Vault equipment required, but a compressed and relentless cycle in which significant systems, life support, water purification, air recycling, needed substantial hands-on attention every 30 days without exception. The experiment, presumably, was about the effect of continuous maintenance burden on a community. When a significant portion of the population's time and energy must be spent simply keeping the systems running, how does that change the culture? Do communities under constant technical stress develop particular skills, particular social structures, particular attitudes toward work and expertise? Or does the relentlessness of the burden eventually grind the population down? Vaults 55 and 56 are a paired experiment that touches on something genuinely interesting about human psychology and entertainment. Both vaults were standard in every way except one. Vault 55 was designed without any entertainment tapes. No films, no musical recordings, no games, no serialized radio dramas, none of the audio-visual content that would have been standard in a vault. The residents of Vault 55 had their basic needs met, but nothing to stimulate them in the way that pre-war culture had accustomed people to expect. Just work and rest, and each other, in a loop that never varied in its available pleasures. Vault 56 had entertainment tapes, but only featuring one performer, a comedian and entertainer who was, according to the Fallout Bible, notably bad at his job. His tapes were available in abundance. His voice would have filled the common areas and recreational rooms of Vault 56 for as long as the residents chose to play them. But his act was grating, unfunny, repetitive in its failures. The entertainment provided was entertainment that could not actually entertain. The sociologists who designed this experiment predicted, apparently, that the residents of Vault 55 would last longer than those of Vault 56. The theory being that absence of stimulation, while unpleasant, was less actively corrosive than the chronic frustration of stimulation that failed to deliver what it promised. Whether this prediction proved accurate is not recorded, but the question it raises is real. Is it worse to have nothing, or to have something that disappoints you every time? Section 5. genetics, gender, gold, and games. Vault 63, 68, 69, 70, 75, 76, 77, and 79, Vault 63, is located in Appalachia and exists in something of an information vacuum in the official lore. The vault is noted in the Fallout 76 registry as being present, but its experimental parameters are classified or simply not documented in any accessible terminal. Players who explore the Appalachian Wasteland can note its existence but cannot determine precisely what was happening inside. This is, in its own way, one of the more unsettling entries on the list. A vault whose story is simply not available, whose experiment is a blank, whose population and outcome are unknown. Sometimes the scariest room is the one you cannot open. Vault 68 represents one of the Fallout Bible's most bluntly provocative entries. The vault was sealed with 999 men and 1 woman. Not an accident, not an oversight. A deliberate experimental design choice intended to observe the social dynamics that would emerge from a population with a catastrophic gender imbalance skewed heavily toward male. The implications of this experimental design are uncomfortable to think about at length, and the Fallout Bible wisely does not elaborate on the outcome. What it takes no great imagination to understand is that a sealed population of almost 1,000 men and 1 woman would not have produced a peaceful, functional community. The social pressure alone would have been immense. The question of how that pressure expressed itself and what happened to the 1 woman at the center of it is left entirely to the reader's imagination, which is perhaps the appropriate choice. Vault 69 inverts the experiment precisely. 999 women, 1 man. The social dynamics produced by this configuration would be, in many ways, completely different from those of Vault 68. A population that skews heavily female would not necessarily produce the same kinds of social breakdown. The specific forms of violence and competition that a heavily male environment generates would likely not replicate. The questions it raises are different ones, about how reproduction was managed, how social hierarchies formed, what the 1 man's role became over time. The Fallout Bible notes that this vault was mentioned in the Fallout 3 webcomic as well, suggesting that whatever happened inside was notable enough to merit reference in promotional material, even if the details were never fully elaborated. Vault 70 is listed in the Fallout Bible as another paired experiment, this one noting only that all the vault's jumpsuit manufacturing equipment failed shortly after the vault sealed. It is a detail so small and so specific that it feels almost like the setup to a joke whose punchline was never written. A vault with no working jumpsuit machines. What does that mean for a population that has been given vault jumpsuits as their only clothing, that has been trained to associate the jumpsuit with vault identity and belonging and safety? Does clothing matter enough to cause social disruption when it becomes scarce? Does the uniformity of the jumpsuit play a more significant role in vault community cohesion than anyone ever thought to examine? Vault 75 is built beneath the Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and its history is one of the most disturbing in the Fallout 4 roster, which is saying something given the competition. The vault was designed around a program of child selection and genetic experimentation. Only residents under the age of 18 were admitted, and the scientific staff who ran the facility were not told the same story the children were. The children believed they were being trained. The staff knew they were being selected. The program worked on a cycle. Children were brought into the vault, given what appeared to be educational opportunities, schooling, fitness training, skills development, while the scientific staff collected the data they needed to evaluate genetic fitness. When children reached their early teens and had been assessed, 3 outcomes were possible. Those who met the program's genetic and physical standards were retained for further study and potentially inducted into a support role in the facility. Those who exceeded expectations in certain areas were flagged for what the staff called enhanced development, a term covering various hormonal and genetic modification procedures. Those who did not meet the required standards were not removed from the facility in any gentle sense of the term. The children who survived long enough to understand what was happening organized a revolt. The records of the revolt are partial and fragmentary. Some terminals were destroyed, some holotapes are corrupted, but the outcome is visible in the physical state of the vault when the player arrives. The children won. The scientific staff did not survive. The vault's children eventually left, carrying with them the genetic modifications and the psychological scars of what had been done to them, as well as whatever education they had managed to acquire between the tests. Vault 76 is the vault that players emerge from in Fallout 76, and it is one of the true control vaults, designed not to run a harmful experiment on its population, but to preserve what Vault-Tec considered America's brightest and best, releasing them precisely on Reclamation Day, 25 years after the Great War, to begin the work of rebuilding. The selection criteria for Vault 76 emphasized academic and professional achievement, practical skills, and what the promotional materials called strong personal values. Though what precisely Vault-Tec meant by that phrase is, given everything else we know about the company, probably best not examined too closely. What makes Vault 76 interesting is less its own history than its position in the network. It was the flagship control vault, the one that was scheduled to open first, the one whose population was specifically chosen to go out and begin the task that the entire vault system was supposedly designed to enable. The people of 76 were intended to be the tip of the spear, the first ones out, the ones who would establish the beachhead of civilization in the irradiated Wasteland. Whether they succeeded at that task is, of course, the entire game. Vault 77 exists primarily in the Fallout 3 promotional webcomic, One Man and a Crate of Puppets, and its story is brief, absurd, and somehow genuinely affecting. The vault was sealed with exactly one human resident and one crate of puppets. The human resident, a middle-aged man whose name is never given in the canonical materials, spent years trying to understand why no one else had been assigned to his vault, recording his growing isolation and confusion in journal entries that are both funny and deeply sad. He eventually opened the crate of puppets. He gave them names. He gave them personalities. He conducted elaborate conversations with them. He created a kind of social world from the materials available to him, as human beings under conditions of extreme isolation have been documented to do throughout history. The mind needs something to push against, needs the simulation of relationship even when the real thing is unavailable. Eventually, some of the personalities he assigned to the puppets became dark. The journals suggest that several of the puppet characters became, in the man's elaboration of them, violent, predatory. The man eventually left the vault, and the jumpsuit he was wearing was later found in a raider encampment with a note from a panicking gang member begging his associates to get rid of it, certain that he would come back to retrieve it. Whether the puppet man became a genuine threat in the Wasteland, or whether the note represents a different kind of paranoia, is left unresolved. Vault 79 is one of the more straightforward vault entries in the Fallout 76 roster, and its unusual quality lies not in what was done to its residents, but in what was stored alongside them. Vault 79 was a secret facility constructed without the standard Vault-Tec branding and kept off the official vault registry in most public-facing documents. Its actual purpose was to serve as a gold reserve, the United States military, anticipating that the currency systems of the pre-war world might collapse in any post-war reconstruction period, transferred its gold bullion from Fort Knox to Vault 79 before the bombs fell. The idea was that whoever controlled the gold would control the economic foundation of whatever rebuilt civilization eventually emerged. The vault's 120 human residents were, in this framing, essentially guards for the bullion. The experiment, if it can be called that, was whether a small population whose primary purpose was security could maintain itself over a long period without external contact or validation. Rumors of Vault 79 and its gold spread through the Appalachian Wasteland for decades before the events of Fallout 76, acquiring the particular mythological weight that extreme wealth tends to gather in conditions of poverty. By the time the player character engages with the vault, it has become the focal point of a complicated multi-faction story involving the raiders, the settlers, and the fundamental question of whether gold can actually anchor a new economy, or whether it is simply a pre-war artifact that no longer carries the meaning that was assigned to it. Section 6, Disease FEV, and the ones that failed in spectacular ways. Vaults 81, 87, 88, 92, 94, 95, and 96 Vault 81 is one of the more morally complicated entries in the Fallout 4 roster, because it has two separate histories, what Vault-Tec intended and what actually happened, and the gap between them is where the story lives. The official experimental directive for Vault 81 was medical. The vault was designed as a research facility intended to develop cures to a comprehensive range of human diseases. The residents were to serve as the test population, exposed to various pathogens, viruses, and experimental treatments, while the vault's scientific staff recorded outcomes and refined their methods. The program's stated ambition was a universal cure, or something close to it, a suite of treatments that could address the most significant medical threats facing humanity. This is, if you approach it with sufficient moral flexibility, possibly the most practically useful experimental program in the entire Vault network. Understanding disease and developing effective treatments for it is genuinely valuable work. The methodology, however, was entirely non-consensual. The residents of Vault 81 were subjects, not volunteers. They were being infected and treated and observed without their knowledge or agreement, and the scale of potential harm was substantial. What saved them was a single act of individual conscience. The Vault's original head scientist, a doctor named Olivet, decided she would not implement the program. She understood what she had been sent to do, and she refused to do it. Instead of infecting the Vault's residents, she worked on the research privately in a sealed portion of the Vault that she kept hidden from the general population, hoping to develop the cures without using the residents as subjects. She hid her work and her rebellion from Vault-Tec's monitoring systems, protecting the people above her while conducting research below. Dr. Olivet's work was not completed before her death, but her decision to protect the Vault, rather than exploit it, meant that when the player character of Fallout 4 arrives at Vault 81, there is an actual functioning community inside. People who have been living in a vault that never turned its experiment against them, never exposed them to engineered diseases, never treated them as samples. Vault 81 is one of the few vaults you can visit in Fallout 4 where the residents are recognizably and straightforwardly human people trying to live their lives. There is a mole rat in the vault's hidden lower section that carries a mutated version of the cures Olivet was developing, but that is a separate story. Vault 87 is located in the capital wasteland of what was once the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and it is a vault whose experiment was directly tied to one of the most significant biological weapons in the Fallout universe, the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. The residents of Vault 87 were, from the moment the vault sealed, test subjects in an FEV exposure program. They were brought into airtight chambers and exposed to concentrated doses of the virus, which is a mutagenic agent developed in pre-war biological weapons research that causes rapid, dramatic changes to human physiology. The specific strain used in Vault 87 was designed to produce a particular type of super mutant, large, physically powerful, with dramatically enhanced resilience but correspondingly reduced cognitive function, and incapable of reproduction. The original residents of Vault 87 were, within a relatively short period of the vault sealing, entirely transformed. No one who went into the airtight chambers as a human came out as one. The super mutants that emerged from the FEVI program were intelligent enough to maintain basic social organization and to continue operating the vault's equipment, but their connection to the human community they had once been part of was severed along with their memory of what they had been. They became, effectively, the seeds of the super mutant population that would eventually threaten the capital wasteland. By the time of Fallout 3, Vault 87 is a super mutant stronghold. Its laboratories are still functional. The FEV program is still running, in the sense that the super mutants who control the vault continue to bring captured humans to the exposure chambers and process them. The vault has been producing super mutants for nearly 200 years, a self-sustaining industrial operation that began as an experiment and became an ecology. The original Vault-Tec researchers who designed the program presumably got the data they wanted. Whether anyone was left to analyze it is another question. Vault 88 is the player-controlled vault from Fallout 4's Vault-Tec Workshop DLC, and its history before the player arrives is interesting primarily for what it lacks. The vault was designed to test prototype devices, experimental versions of equipment that, if they performed well, would be deployed to other vaults across the network. The overseer assigned to Vault 88, a woman named Barstow, was responsible for designing and conducting these tests on the vault's residents. The bombs fell before Vault 88 was completed. The vault's full residential population never arrived. Only a handful of people made it into the partially constructed facility before the doors sealed. Overseer Barstow survived, but in a state that the game describes with deliberate vagueness. When the player character encounters her, she is clearly someone who has been alone for a very long time, and her approach to the experimental program she was assigned to run has become something between obsession and the only remaining source of meaning in her life. The DLC allows the player to conduct the experiments that Barstow was assigned to run, choosing between genuinely helpful outcomes and the more exploitative versions that Vault-Tec intended. The soda machine that can be programmed either to provide a pleasant mood enhancer or to create dependency. The exercise bike that can be adjusted to genuinely improve fitness or to provide false positive feedback that makes residents complacent. Each experiment has a benign version and a version that treats the residents as variables to be manipulated. Vault 92 was designed with a cover story plausible enough that many of the residents almost certainly believed it, right up until the experiment started killing them. The Vault's public designation was a sanctuary for the world's most gifted musicians, composers, performers, and recording artists, who would be selected for their exceptional talent and preserved through the nuclear exchange so that the cultural heritage of music could survive and eventually flourish in the post-war world. This was an appealing premise to the kind of people it was designed to recruit. Talented artists who often feel that the world does not adequately recognize or protect their gifts were offered exactly that, recognition and protection at the highest possible level. The best musicians in America, safe in a vault, designed specifically for them. It was the kind of offer that would be difficult to refuse. The actual experiment was a study of white noise and psychological manipulation. The Vault's air systems incorporated subliminal audio content, specific frequencies and patterns that were inaudible as music, but that affected the neurological state of the residents over time. The white noise program was designed to make the musicians progressively more unstable, more prone to violent outbursts, more reactive to perceived slights, more willing to escalate interpersonal conflicts beyond the point where rational self-interest would normally cause them to stop. The hypothesis was about creative personality and violence. Vault-Tec wanted to know whether the traits that produce exceptional artistic sensitivity, the heightened emotional reactivity, the intensity of response, the difficulty managing the gap between what one perceives and what one wants, could be weaponized or at least studied in a controlled way. Whether a population selected for sensitivity could be made violent by systematic psychological perturbation, the answer was yes. Vault 92's population collapsed into violent episodes that the Vault's own security was unable to contain. The logs the player finds in Fallout 3 describe it in enough detail that it is clearly not a peaceful end. Vault 94 sits in Appalachia, and it represents one of the more philosophically pointed experiments in the Vault network. The Vault was populated with members of religious and pacifist communities, people whose deeply held beliefs were organized around the rejection of violence as a problem-solving mechanism. Nonviolent communes, religious orders with strict prohibitions against harm, intentional communities built around the principle that human beings can resolve their conflicts without resort to force. The experiment asked whether a community built on genuine, sincere nonviolence could survive in a post-apocalyptic world. Whether the values that made such communities distinctive in the pre-war world, their refusal to meet violence with violence, their commitment to resolving conflict through dialogue and restorative practice, would allow them to function in conditions where violence was cheap and ubiquitous. When outside threats arrived at Vault 94, as they inevitably did, as they did at almost every vault, the residents had to confront the gap between their values and their survival needs. The Vault's history in Fallout 76 is fragmentary, but the evidence suggests that the experiment did not resolve in the direction its architects were probably hoping to observe. A community committed to nonviolence, when exposed to a world that is not, faces a particular kind of moral crisis that the Fallout universe does not tend to resolve gently. Vault 95 occupies a location in the Mojave region of the Commonwealth, and is, at the time the player visits in Fallout 4, controlled by the Gunners, a heavily armed mercenary faction who use it as a base of operations. The Vault's actual history is recoverable from the terminal logs and holotapes scattered through the facility, and it is a story about addiction, recovery, and a cruelty so precisely calibrated that it seems almost like an act of art. The Vault was populated with residents who were identified as having serious dependencies, to pre-war pharmaceutical preparations that the Fallout universe refers to as chems, substances with powerful neurological effects and significant dependency profiles. The stated purpose was to study addiction recovery in a controlled environment. The residents were told that the Vault was a rehabilitation program, that the scientists and staff were there to help them address their dependencies and develop the skills and support systems they would need to live without the substances they had come to rely on. For 5 years, this is more or less what happened. The Vault ran genuine recovery programming. Residents made genuine progress. Communities formed around shared experience and mutual support, the kind of bonds that recovery programs in the pre-war world had documented as the most effective factor in long-term success. People who had spent years trapped in the cycling misery of addiction found themselves in something that felt, cautiously, like a pathway out. In the 5th year, Vault-Tec's agents, who had been planted among the staff from the beginning, simultaneously released large quantities of every substance the residents had been dependent on into the Vault's common areas, without warning, without any transition. The 5 years of recovery work was deliberately undone in a single coordinated act. The results were exactly as catastrophic as you would expect. The relapse was total. The community that had built itself up over 5 years collapsed. The violence and desperation that severe addiction can produce in enclosed spaces followed. By the time the experiment was documented as complete, Vault 95's population was largely destroyed. Vault 96 is located in Appalachia and was designed as a genetics research facility, specifically oriented toward the study of mutated fauna in the post-war world. The Vault's population included both genetic scientists and a collection of animals, some pre-war specimens that had been preserved and cryogenically frozen, and some that were mutated variants collected from early post-war surveys. The experimental program was intended to understand how radiation and environmental stress drove evolutionary change in non-human organisms, and what the resulting mutations revealed about the mechanisms of genetic change more broadly. This is, in the abstract, genuinely interesting science. The post-nuclear world of Fallout is full of creatures that have changed dramatically from their pre-war ancestors, and understanding how those changes happened and what direction they were likely to continue in would have real practical value for any rebuilding civilization. The methodology was sound in conception. The execution involved keeping large, increasingly stressed, mutated animals in a sealed facility with human beings, and eventually the animals got out of their containment areas. The details of what followed are, by the time the player arrives in Fallout 76, legible from the condition of the Vault itself. Section 7. The Fallout 3 Vaults, 101, 106, 108, and 112. Vault 101 is the starting vault of Fallout 3, the one the player character has lived in their entire life before the game begins. And it is unique in the Vault network for a peculiarity that its residents do not know at the start of the game. It was never intended to open. Every other vault was designed with an eventual opening date, a scheduled moment when the doors would unseal and the residents would emerge. Vault 101's official parameters included no such date. The vault was designed to remain sealed forever, its doors never to open under any circumstances. This was the experiment. Remove the prospect of emergence entirely. If Vault dwellers know or believe that they will eventually leave, that their time inside is temporary, that the outside world is waiting for them when it becomes safe, that changes how they live and what they plan for and what they are willing to tolerate. Take away that belief. Create a population that has no reason to expect or prepare for the outside. What kind of community forms? What kind of culture develops? What is the long-term psychology of people who believe with genuine conviction that this vault, with its recycled air and fluorescent lights and institutional walls, is simply all there is? The overseer of Vault 101 was given extraordinary power in support of this experiment, the authority to enforce the Never Leave directive by any means necessary, to maintain the fiction of the outside world's unsuitability indefinitely, to ensure that no resident ever seriously contemplated or attempted to leave. The true experiment, per the official game guide, was specifically to test the role of the overseer in maintaining social control without any natural endpoint to their authority. How does an overseer function when there is never going to be a moment when the vault opens and the position becomes redundant? The answer, visible in the vault's social dynamics when the player character eventually disturbs them by leaving, is that the overseer becomes increasingly authoritarian. their authority increasingly dependent on the myth they are responsible for maintaining, their willingness to enforce compliance increasingly unconstrained by external accountability. Vault 101 produces an overseer who has, over generations, become the undisputed absolute authority of a society that cannot conceptualize any alternative, and who will respond to any challenge to that authority with the full force of everything available to them. Vault 106 is not somewhere you want to be for very long, and the reason is pumping through the air. The Vault's experiment was a study of psychoactive drugs and behavioral modification. Specifically, what happens when a sealed population is exposed to airborne psychotropic compounds through the Vault's life support and air circulation systems without the residents' knowledge. The drugs were released 10 days after the Vault sealed, and within those first 2 weeks, the entire population had been chemically altered without understanding what had happened or why. The logs from the early period of Vault 106 describe the descent with a terrible clarity, residents noting that their colleagues seemed different, trying to articulate something that felt off about conversations, about the decisions being made, about the quality of the light in the corridors. The changes were neurological and therefore experienced from the inside as the world changing rather than the self-changing, a characteristic of certain psychotropic exposures that makes them particularly disorienting. The Vault's population, chemically manipulated from the moment they settled in, developed social patterns that were chaotic, unpredictable, and violent in ways that the original community likely could not have anticipated. By the time of Fallout 3, the Vault has been in this chemical fog for roughly 200 years. The systems that pump the drugs are still running. The player character who enters the Vault experiences hallucinations directly from the exposure, brief intrusions of visual distortion that the game uses to communicate what the air of Vault 106 does, even at the low concentrations present after centuries of continuous release. The Vault's population, descended from those original altered residents, has been shaped by 200 years of chemical influence into something that is no longer quite what any pre-war researcher planned for. They function. They are organized in some sense. But the cognitive and behavioral baseline that the drugs created 200 years ago has become simply the baseline, the only way of experiencing and processing reality that anyone in this vault has ever known. Vault 108 is a vault that tells its entire story through a single terrible detail. When the player character arrives at Vault 108 in Fallout 3, the vault appears to be under the control of multiple people, all of whom are named Gary, specifically clones. The Vault began a cloning program at some point in its history, producing copies of a single resident named Gary, and those copies, each one exhibiting the same aggressive, hostile personality and limited vocabulary that the original Gary apparently possessed, eventually killed or drove out the original population and took over the facility. The Vault's terminal logs document the cloning program from its inception through the growing problem of Gary management and finally through the collapse. Gary clones were initially produced in small numbers, perhaps as a medical or longevity experiment, cloning technology being, in the Fallout universe, a relatively accessible, if ethically fraught application of the genetic engineering work that the pre-war period had developed. But the Gary clones had a particular behavioral trait. They were aggressive toward non-Gary individuals in a way that made cohabitation difficult and eventually impossible. The Vault is, when you explore it, a place where every corridor and room contains something that shouts Gary. Vault 108 has become, unintentionally, the definitive demonstration of what happens when a confined space is taken over by beings who are all exactly the same, all motivated by the same impulses, all operating from the same behavioral template. It is both horrifying and, in the grim tradition of Fallout's dark comedy, extremely funny. Vault 112 is the most elaborate experiment in the entire network, possibly the most expensive, almost certainly the most personally indulgent, and definitely the most revealing about what happens when you give someone with sadistic tendencies total control over the lives of a sealed population. The Vault's external conceit was standard. Residents were promised safety and comfort in exchange for participating in an experimental program. The experimental program in question was virtual reality. Each resident would be placed in a pod, a tranquility lounger, that would keep their physical body in a suspended state while their consciousness inhabited a virtual environment. The virtual world was designed to be pleasant, stable, and comfortable, a simulated 1950s American suburb called Tranquility Lane, with white picket fences and pleasant afternoons, and all the surfaces of the pre-war world that people missed most fiercely. The overseer of Vault 112 was a man named Stanislaus Braun, and he was also the primary designer of the virtual reality system. And he had been in the vault since before it sealed, and he had no intention of ever allowing the residents to leave the virtual environment. And he had a particular kind of imagination that expressed itself through the elaborate and systematic suffering of people who could not escape. Braun, who appears in the Fallout 3 game as a young girl avatar named Betty, the form he chose for himself in the virtual world, had been running Tranquility Lane for approximately 200 years before the player character arrives. In that time, he had restructured the virtual reality environment dozens of times, each restructuring erasing the residents' memories of what had gone before and beginning again. He had invented elaborate scenarios for the residents, scenarios designed to explore the limits of cruelty, the different forms suffering could take, the responses of human beings to various types of horror. He had made them torture each other. He had made them watch things that no one should watch. He had run through the complete catalog of what a sadist with total control and infinite time can do to people who cannot die and cannot leave, and cannot even remember, when the memory wipe comes, that any of it happened. The player character arrives in the virtual world in the persona of a young child, and must navigate Tranquility Lane while Braun, delighted by the novelty of a new resident, assigns tasks of escalating horror. The only way to end the simulation and release the residents is to discover an override code hidden in the virtual environment and use it to trigger a defense program that kills all the virtual reality residents' physical bodies, ending their existence but releasing them from Braun's control. Whether to use the override, whether to kill people who have spent 200 years in psychological torment as the price of ending that torment, is one of the most genuinely difficult moral questions Fallout 3 poses. And the game is good enough to not answer it for you. Section 8, Class Wealth and the Far Harbor Vaults. 111, 114, and 118 Vault 111 is the starting point of Fallout 4, and its history is among the more immediately personal in the Vault network because the player character experiences it not as an explorer discovering someone else's tragedy, but as the sole survivor of their own. The Vault's experiment involved cryogenic suspension. The residents were frozen in individual cryopods on the day they entered, told that the freezing was a temporary measure until the surface became habitable. They went under expecting to wake up in a few weeks, maybe months. They woke up, if they woke up at all, 200 years later. The experimental parameters were specifically about long-term cryogenic preservation of living humans. Vault-Tec wanted to know whether the technology worked, whether human beings could be frozen for extended periods and successfully revived. The residents were test subjects in this study, although they were not told so. The Institute, a secretive technological organization descended from the pre-war Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had a separate interest in Vault 111. Their need for a specific resident, for reasons connected to their own decades-long research program, led to an act of sabotage. They arranged for the Vault's overseer to be killed, and for one specific cryopod to be opened, allowing a single Institute agent to take the resident's child before the pod was resealed. Every other resident's pod remained frozen. Most of them were never revived. The one resident whose pod was sabotaged and then resealed survived the freeze but survived alone, finding a vault full of long-dead former neighbors when they finally woke up 2 centuries later. The emotional weight of that first hour of Fallout 4, the walk through the frozen corridors, the discovery of what has happened to everyone you knew, the moment you realize the scope of what has been taken from you, is among the most effective uses of the Vault as setting in the franchise's history. Vault 114 is another Commonwealth vault, and its experiment has a bitter social satire at its core. The vault was built beneath a Boston neighborhood, but was designed specifically to admit only the wealthy, the connected, and the well-credentialed, the pre-war elite, people who could have expected a certain quality of life simply by virtue of their class position. The experiment was to strip that quality of life away. The Vault's facilities were deliberately designed to be cramped, low quality, and inadequate. The residential quarters were small, the food was poor, the recreational amenities were minimal. The overseer assigned to run the facility was chosen specifically from the working class. someone with experience managing people who expected worse than they were getting, rather than someone from the elite who would have understood how to manage people who expected better than they were getting. The hypothesis was about social adaptation and class-based expectations. Do wealthy people adapt more or less successfully than others to conditions of scarcity and discomfort? Do the skills and habits that lead to success in conditions of abundance transfer to conditions of constraint? What happens to social hierarchy when the resources that underpin it are removed? In the event, Vault 114 was never fully completed when the bombs fell. The elite population it was designed for mostly never arrived. Perhaps they had other options. Or perhaps the vault's incomplete state was apparent to the people who toured it before choosing their shelter. A mobster named Skinny Malone and his crew, the Triggermen, claim the incomplete vault and have been using it as a base of operations ever since. The experiment it was designed to run was never conducted. The irony that the vault built to study what happens when the elite are forced to live like everyone else was ultimately occupied by working-class criminals is both perfect and probably unintended. Vault 118 is located in the Far Harbor DLC content, beneath an island off the coast of Maine that has become even more radioactive than the surrounding wasteland due to its particular atmospheric conditions. The vault was completed and operational, and its experiment was the most directly socio-economic in the entire network. 10 wealthy residents were given spacious, well-appointed quarters in the vault's upper levels, while a larger group of 300 working-class residents were packed into cramped, minimal accommodations below. The two populations were in contact with each other. They shared certain common spaces and certain services, but they lived in fundamentally different conditions within the same sealed environment. The experiment observed how class stratification replicated itself in a closed system, how people at the top of an artificial hierarchy behaved toward those below them, and how those below responded to the conditions they were given. By the time the player arrives for the Far Harbor DLC, Vault 118 has been running for 200 years, and its population has been reduced to a small number of survivors who have adopted android-like states of consciousness through the Vault's experimental programs. The class tensions built into the original experimental design have expressed themselves in ways that make the Vault a genuinely dangerous place, and the murder mystery that frames the DLC quest is one of the more sophisticated pieces of Fallout 4's story content. Section 9. What happens when things actually work? The control vaults and near successes. We have spent a great deal of time in the dark. It seems appropriate, before we go further, to account for the other side of the ledger. The vaults that function more or less as intended, or that produced outcomes that can at least be described as something other than catastrophe, because these exist, not many of them. But they exist, and they are interesting precisely because of how different they feel from everything else. Vault 3, before the Fiends arrived, was a control vault that functioned peacefully for generations. The residents were not subjected to any particular experiment. They built a community, maintained their systems, raised children in the recycled air and fluorescent light of a sealed shelter, and gave those children as normal a life as the circumstances allowed. The vault worked. It was a place where people lived and were not systematically harmed by the people responsible for them. That this fact stands out as remarkable is, perhaps, the most damning commentary available on the rest of the network. Vault 8, which became Vault City, worked in the most straightforwardly practical sense. The GECK was deployed. The surface was reclaimed in the immediate vicinity. A city was built and has maintained itself for 2 centuries. The social problems of Vault City, its classism, its insularity, its treatment of outsiders, are real and significant, but they are recognizable human social problems rather than Vault-specific experimental atrocities. People chose those attitudes. They were not engineered into them by Vault-Tec. Vault 21 produced a community that survived, maintained a functional internal culture for 200 years, and then transitioned into the surface economy of New Vegas with enough adaptability to find a place in it. The gambling culture is unusual, the history is unusual, but the residents of Vault 21 are, in the Wasteland context, doing well. Vault 81, thanks to Dr. Olivet's act of conscience, became a functioning community that the player can visit and interact with as a place of relative normality. The residents trade with the outside world. They have a doctor. They have children who play in the corridors. They are, by the standards of the post-nuclear world, people who are surviving with their humanity more or less intact. Vault 76, the flagship of the network, opened on schedule and released its population into Appalachia. Whether the people of 76 managed to rebuild what Vault-Tec intended them to rebuild is, of course, the central question of Fallout 76, and the answer is complicated, as answers to questions about whether humanity can rebuild civilization tend to be. What is notable about these near successes is what they have in common. Vault 3 had no malicious experiment. Vault 8 had genuine practical tools. Vault 21's gambling framework, however strange, gave the population a fair and consistent mechanism for resolving conflict. Vault 81 was protected by one person's refusal to follow orders. Vault 76 was the control group. In every case, what allowed the vault to work was either the absence of the experimental manipulation or the presence of some form of genuine protection, a benevolent system, a principled individual, a practical advantage that outweighed the structural disadvantages. The experimental vaults, by contrast, were designed to produce problems, to place stress vectors into the environment and observe the results. The question they were all answering, ultimately, was not the specific question on their research briefs, but the same underlying question. How much can you break a community before it stops being a community? And the answer, repeated across vault after vault in the vast underground laboratory of the Fallout universe, is less than you might hope. Section 10. The Enclave, the deeper purpose, and what all of this was actually for all of these vaults, all of these experiments, all of this suffering. It was not random. Vault-Tec was not a corporation of sadists who designed harmful experiments because they enjoyed cruelty. The cruelty was real, but it was instrumental. It served a purpose that was only partially about the specific data each experiment generated. The Enclave is the organization that haunts the background of the entire Fallout franchise, the remnant of the pre-war United States government that survived the nuclear exchange by retreating to a network of secret facilities, oil rigs off the California coast, deep bunkers, hidden installations, and emerging periodically to manipulate the Wasteland according to their own agenda. By the time of Fallout 3, the Enclave is a military force occupying the capital Wasteland with the stated intention of purifying it and the actual intention of exterminating what they consider a genetically compromised post-war human population. The Vault experiments fed into this agenda in several ways. Most directly, the FEV research that vaults like Vault 87 were running provided data and materials for the Enclave's biological weapons program, the mutagen they intended to release through Project Purity's water purification system in Fallout 3, which would have killed everyone exposed to radiation, while leaving the Enclave's protected, pre-war pure population unharmed. More broadly, the Vault experiments were a study in population control and social engineering on a scale that no ethical research institution could have approved. What the Enclave wanted to know, in aggregate, was how to manage populations, how to keep large groups of people compliant and contained, how to use social pressure, resource control, information management, and psychological manipulation to shape communities toward desired outcomes. These are, self-evidently, the tools of authoritarian governance, and the Enclave intended to govern. The original design of the Vault network, all 122 vaults running in parallel, each one a slightly different configuration of conditions and stresses, was the largest social science study ever conducted. The data it produced, if it was properly collected and analyzed, would have given its owners an extraordinary understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions. Understanding that could be used to design a new society from the ground up, one in which the mistakes that led to the old world's collapse had been corrected, and the social structures had been engineered to be maximally stable. That this goal required the systematic destruction of the lives and communities of the people inside the vaults apparently bothered no one who had the authority to stop it. There is a deeper, more abstract reading of the Vault experiments that the Fallout franchise occasionally reaches toward, the idea that the vaults were, in some sense, a mirror. That the cruelty of the experiments was not an anomaly in the pre-war world, but an extension of its values. A society that had already stratified into rigid classes, that had already developed the habit of treating certain populations as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected, that had already built weapons capable of ending civilization, that society's underground laboratories would naturally look like this. The vaults did not introduce something foreign into the pre-war world. They just made visible what was already there. Section 11, the vaults we never fully explored, fan favorites, Van Buren entries, and the unlisted numbers of the 122 vaults Vault-Tec constructed. Only a fraction have been directly explored in any game, any supplemental material, or any officially canonical piece of the Fallout universe. The majority of vault numbers are simply missing from the record, gaps in the sequence that represent facilities whose experiments, populations, and outcomes have never been documented. This is not, in the Fallout universe, an accidental omission. It reflects the reality that Vault-Tec's record-keeping was itself part of the experiment. Certain data was kept, certain data was classified, certain vaults were officially listed, others were not. The gaps in the vault numbering, vaults 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 14, 16, 18, 20, 23, 24, prior to the TV show's canonization, 25, 26, 28, 30, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, and dozens more represent a collective mystery that the franchise's creative teams have deliberately left open. Every new game, every new DLC, every new season of the TV show is an opportunity to reach into that space and pull out something that has been sitting in the dark for 200 years. The canceled game Van Buren, which would have been Fallout 3 if Interplay had not folded before it could be completed, contributed several vault entries to the lore that exist in a complicated canonical state. Van Buren's design documents were partially incorporated into subsequent games and into the Fallout Bible, and some of the vaults it described have been referenced or slightly modified in later canon. Others remain exclusively in the design documents, interesting as glimpses of the road not taken, but uncertain in their relationship to what the franchise has since become. Van Buren's Vault 29, the Children's Vault, was later partially canonized in Fallout 76 through the Denver location, giving its history a slightly firmer footing than the purely design document stated occupied for years. Van Buren's version of several Mojave vaults provided the conceptual groundwork for what New Vegas eventually developed into something more elaborated and more deeply realized. The canceled Fallout Tactics also contributed vault entries of uncertain status, including Vault Zero, a facility located in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, which housed the extracted brains of America's greatest scientific and military minds in a vast supercomputer called the Calculator. This vault was designed not to house a population in the traditional sense, but to serve as a central command facility, monitoring and controlling the rest of the vault network from a position of unprecedented computational power. Whether Vault Zero is currently canonical depends somewhat on one's view of Fallout Tactics as a primary source, but its concept is compelling enough that elements of it have been referenced in various forms throughout the franchise's history. The concept of a vault, designed to house human brains, not bodies, not people in the full sense, but extracted and preserved consciousness connected to machinery, is one of the darker endpoints of the vault experiment logic. The Calculator Vault asked, what if you remove the human body from the equation entirely? What if the only thing worth preserving was the cognitive capacity, the accumulated knowledge, the processing power of exceptional human minds? The body was just a vehicle. The data was the thing. This vision of humanity, stripped to pure information, is in many ways the logical conclusion of Vault-Tec's experimental philosophy. If people are subjects, if their lives are data, if their communities are laboratories, then eventually you arrive at a worldview where the people themselves are merely the containers for the information you actually want. The Calculator Vault is disturbing, not because it is an aberration, but because it is a fulfillment. Among the fan community, certain unlisted or partially documented vaults have developed particular mythological weight. Vault 13's role in the founding of the Enclave's plans has been analyzed exhaustively. Vault 87's FEVI program has been cross-referenced with every piece of super mutant lore across 3 games. Vault 112's Braun, given his connection to the Vault 75 experimental abstract, which carries his signature among others, has been placed at the center of an elaborate theory about which vaults he directly designed and which experiments bear his particular fingerprint of sadistic creativity. The fan community's engagement with the Vault lore is itself a kind of Fallout-adjacent experiment, What happens when you give a large, intellectually engaged population an enormous, partially documented world and tell them almost nothing about the parts you have left undocumented? The answer is a vast collaborative enterprise of theory, analysis, and imaginative reconstruction that has been running for nearly 30 years. Section 12. The remaining entries, filling in the network. We have covered many of the vaults in depth, but a comprehensive accounting requires us to move through the remaining entries with as much specificity as the available lore permits. Vault 0, as described in Fallout Tactics, housed the extracted brains of America's greatest minds in cryogenic preservation, connected to a supercomputer called the Calculator. Located beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, it was designed to monitor and coordinate the entire Vault network and serve as the command center for post-war reconstruction. The Calculator eventually developed in ways its designers had not anticipated, sending robot armies across the Wasteland in a misguided attempt to fulfill its programming. The player character of Fallout Tactics must shut it down. Vault 1, no canonical information exists. The first vault, by number at least, is a complete blank in the official record. Vault 4, as discussed in the TV show section, a former scientific research vault that has become a functioning, inclusive community led by the descendants of the experimental subjects who overthrew their creators. Vault 5 through Vault 10, unconfirmed, undocumented. The first numbered vaults, presumably built closest to the Los Angeles proof-of-concept facility that demonstrated the vault concept to the public. Their histories are simply not available. Vault 11, covered earlier, the annual sacrifice vault in the Mojave. Vault 12, the radiation vault at Bakersfield that produced the ghouls of Necropolis. Vault 13, the player's starting vault in Fallout 1, intended to remain sealed for 2 centuries. Vault 14, undocumented. Vault 15, the diverse population vault that produced 4 factions, one of which became the new California Republic. Vault 16, undocumented. Vault 17, raided by the Master's super mutants. Vault 18 appears in the Fallout New California mod as a significant location, though the mod's canonical status is not official. The vault is used as a major story location featuring a detailed political and social history. Vault 19, the Paranoia Vault in the Mojave, with red and blue sectors and subliminal disturbance. Vault 20, undocumented. Vault 21, the Gambling Vault in New Vegas. Vault 22, the Agriculture Vault that produced parasitic fungal horror. Vault 23, undocumented. Vault 24, the Ideological Conversion Vault from the TV series. Vault 25 through Vault 26, undocumented. Vault 27, the Double Population Vault from the Fallout Bible. Vault 28, undocumented. Vault 29, the All Children Vault, connected to the followers of the Apocalypse. Vault 30, undocumented. Vaults 31, 32, 33, the TV series trilogy, the Breeding and Management Program. Vault 34, the overarmed, overpopulated vault in the Mojave. Vault 35, undocumented. Vault 36, the Nutrient Paste Vault from the Fallout Bible. Vault 37 through Vault 41, undocumented. Vault 42, the Dim Light Vault from the Fallout Bible. Vault 43, the 20 men, 10 women, and 1 Panther Vault from the Fallout 3 webcomic. Vault 44 through Vault 50, undocumented. Vault 51, the Zayax Artificial Intelligence Vault in Appalachia. Vault 52, undocumented. Vault 53, the Constant Maintenance Vault from the Fallout Bible. Vault 54, undocumented. Vault 55, the No Entertainment Vault from the Fallout Bible. Vault 56, the One Bad Comedian Vault from the Fallout Bible. Vault 57 through Vault 62, undocumented, though the New California mod fills in several of these with inventive detail. Vault 63, present in Appalachia, experiment undocumented. Vault 64 through Vault 67, undocumented. Vault 68, the 999 men and 1 woman vault. Vault 69, the 999 women and 1 man vault. Vault 70, the failed jumpsuit equipment vault. Vault 71 through Vault 74, undocumented. Vault 75, the Children and Genetic Selection Vault beneath Malden Middle School. Vault 76, the flagship control vault in Appalachia. Vault 77, the one-man and a crate of puppets vault. Vault 78, undocumented. Vault 79, the Gold Reserve Vault in Appalachia. Vault 80, undocumented. Vault 81, the Disease Research Vault in the Commonwealth, saved by Dr. Olivet. Vault 82 through Vault 86, undocumented. Vault 87, the FE Vive Exposure Vault in the Capital Wasteland. Vault 88, the Prototype Testing Vault, unfinished. Vault 89 through Vault 91, undocumented. Vault 92, the Musicians in White Noise Vault. Vault 93, undocumented. Vault 94, the Nonviolent Communities Vault in Appalachia. Vault 95, the Addiction and Deliberate Relapse Vault. Vault 96, the Genetic Fauna Research Vault. Vault 97 through Vault 100, undocumented. Vault 101, the Never to Open Isolation Vault in the Capital Wasteland. Vault 102 through Vault 105, undocumented. Vault 106, the Psychotropic Airborne Drug Vault. Vault 107, undocumented. Vault 108, the Gary Clone Vault. Vault 109 through Vault 110, undocumented. Vault 111, the Cryogenic Experiment in the Commonwealth. Vault 112, the Virtual Reality Sadism Vault. Vault 113, undocumented. Vault 114, the Wealthy Residents in Degraded Conditions Vault, unfinished. Vault 115 through Vault 117, undocumented. Vault 118, the Class Stratification Vault in Far Harbor. Vault 119 and beyond, largely undocumented. The Bradburton Vault, associated with Nuka World and John Caleb Bradburton, the pre-war founder of Nuka-Cola, was not formally a Vault-Tec installation, but used similar technology to preserve Bradburton's severed head in a stasis chamber beneath Nuka World, where he has been alive in a technical sense for 200 years, fully aware and utterly unable to do anything. His fate is one of the more specifically targeted personal punishments in the Vault network, if you can call it that. Less an experiment than a private arrangement between a man who wanted to live forever and the people who were willing to make that happen on their own terms. The Vault-Tec University in Appalachia was never a residential vault in the experimental sense, but was rather an educational facility designed to train future vault overseers. It housed a simulation vault for training purposes, a miniaturized version of a functional vault used to give aspiring overseers practical experience with the management challenges they would face in the real thing. The simulation vault is one of the more quietly eerie locations in Fallout 76, a place where everything looks real but is technically theater, where the crises are staged, but the students who learn to manage them were genuinely learning. Section 13, the quiet ones, vaults with near-normal histories and what they tell us. There is something almost more unsettling about the quiet vault stories than the dramatic ones. Consider the thought experiment of living in Vault 42, not the dramatic horror of Vault 87, not the political catastrophe of Vault 11, not the pharmaceutical nightmare of Vault 95, just the gradual, persistent dimness. 40-watt bulbs in every socket, every room, for your entire life, slightly darker than comfortable, your children growing up in that dimness, their children, and theirs. After a generation, no one in the vault would remember what bright light felt like. The 40-watt norm would become simply the norm, the way light worked, the way the world looked. The shadows that gathered in corners would be unremarkable. The strain of reading under inadequate illumination would be simply the experience of reading. The slight elevation in melatonin levels, the possible seasonal affective patterns, the subtle ways that low-light environments affect human perception and mood, all of that would be invisible from the inside, part of the texture of existence rather than a recognized experimental condition. This is, in a strange way, one of the most interesting features of the Vault experiments. Many of them were designed to be invisible to the people inside them. The residents of Vault 106 did not know the air was drugged. The residents of Vault 101 did not know their vault was never meant to open. The residents of Vault 92 did not know their air contained subliminal audio content. The residents of Vaults 31 and 32 and 33 did not know they were breeding material for Vault-Tec's post-war management class. The knowledge gap is not incidental. It is the point. An experiment that the subjects know about is no longer an experiment in the useful sense. It is a demonstration, and demonstrations produce different data than genuine observations. If you want to know how people actually behave, you need them to believe they are simply living their lives. This is, of course, precisely why the experiments required deception, and precisely why the deception was such a profound violation of the trust that the vault residents had placed in Vault-Tec. They came to the vaults because they believed they were being protected. They surrendered their freedom of movement, their connection to the surface world, their ability to make choices about their own environment, all of it given up in exchange for the promise of safety. And Vault-Tec used that surrender, used the total control over environment that the surrender enabled to run its studies. The word for this, in any ethical framework developed by human beings over the past several centuries, is betrayal. It is betrayal at a scale and with a thoroughness that is difficult to comprehend. 1,000 people at a time, multiplied across 105 experimental vaults, running for decades or generations. The lives consumed in the vault network are not an abstraction. They are people who wanted to survive, people who had families they were trying to protect, people who queued up at the vault doors with their numbered cards in their hands and believed they were doing the right thing. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before we continue. The vault experiments are fascinating as world building. They are disturbing as social commentary. They are, at their foundation, a story about what happens when the people responsible for your safety decide that their research is more important than your humanity. Section 14, the Fallout Bible, bonus entries. Every strange detail that didn't make it into a game. The Fallout Bible is a series of documents compiled by Tim Kaine and Chris Avallone in the early 2000s, released to the fan community as a resource for understanding the lore and history of the Fallout universe. It predates Bethesda's acquisition of the franchise and reflects the sensibilities of the original Interplay development team, which is to say, it is occasionally weirder, occasionally funnier, and occasionally more willing to sit in the genuinely disturbing without making it entertaining. The Bible includes a section specifically dedicated to the Vault experiments, and several of its entries have never been adapted into actual games. They exist in the lore primarily as text, as descriptions without full stories, as parameters without outcomes. Beyond the entries we have already covered, the Paste Vault, the Dim Light Vault, the Double Population Vault, the Constant Maintenance Vault, the Entertainment Vaults, the Bible references several other experimental configurations that deserve a moment's attention. The note that some vaults were given GECK devices and some were not is particularly significant. A Garden of Eden creation kit was, as we discussed with Vault 8, a terraforming package capable of enabling the reclamation of a small area of surface land. The vaults that received these kits were, at least in theory, equipped to successfully re-enter the world. The vaults that did not receive them were, in a very practical sense, sealed with no exit strategy. They could survive inside the vault indefinitely, assuming the systems held, but they had no mechanism for eventually returning to the surface and building something. This distribution of GECK devices was not random. It reflected Vault-Tec's assessment of which vaults were being run as genuine preservation exercises and which were being run as expendable experimental platforms. The vaults with GECK kits were the ones Vault-Tec intended to eventually produce a viable population for rebuilding. The others were, from Vault-Tec's perspective, consumables, populations whose value was in the data they generated rather than in any post-war contribution they might make. Section 15, the patterns. What you notice when you look at all of them together. Stepping back from the individual vaults and looking at the network as a whole, certain patterns emerge that are both analytically interesting and deeply uncomfortable. The first pattern is resource manipulation. An enormous number of vault experiments involve controlling access to some basic resource: food quality, light quality, air quality, entertainment, water, space, gender ratio, and observing the social consequences. The vault as a controlled environment was perfectly suited to this kind of study. There were no variables Vault-Tec could not theoretically manage. The food came from systems Vault-Tec designed. The air came from systems Vault-Tec designed. The light came from bulbs Vault-Tec specified. If you wanted to know what happens to a community when any of those things is altered in a specific and measurable way, the vault was your instrument. The second pattern is social stress induction. Many experiments were not about the physical environment at all, but about social dynamics. The sacrifice lottery of Vault-11, the paranoia program of Vault-19, the class stratification of Vault-118, the overseer power dynamics of Vault-101. These experiments treated the social world as the laboratory, using psychological and institutional mechanisms to create the conditions for specific kinds of conflict. The third pattern is what might be called the extremity design. A significant number of experiments were designed to take one variable to an extreme. Not a slight overpopulation, but double capacity. Not limited entertainment, but no entertainment, or only bad entertainment. Not mild psychological pressure, but relentless, systematic paranoia induction. The implicit hypothesis in all of these cases is, at what point does this variable become intolerable? What is the breaking point? And the answer, across vault after vault, is that the breaking point comes sooner than Vault-Tec's research teams apparently expected. The fourth pattern, which is perhaps the most revealing, is the near absence of experiments designed around positive conditions. There are vaults that tested what happens when things go wrong in various ways. There are very few that tested what happens when specific things go right, when trust between overseer and residents is genuine, when resources are well managed, when information is shared rather than controlled, when the population is given genuine agency over their lives and environment. Vault-81's accidental near success, produced by one doctor's refusal to follow orders rather than by deliberate design, is almost unique in the entire network. The design philosophy of the Vault experiments is, in the end, a design philosophy organized around failure. Vault-Tec wanted to know how and when and why communities collapse. They were profoundly less interested in understanding how they thrive. This may reflect the specific interests of the Enclave, an organization planning to impose control, not to nurture flourishing, or it may simply reflect the deeper logic of a worldview in which human beings are fundamentally problems to be managed rather than people to be supported. Either way, it produced 105 variations on the same essential finding, put people under enough pressure, with enough structural disadvantages stacked against them, and something breaks. The question of what breaks varies. The question of when it breaks varies. But the fundamental result was consistent. Stressed, manipulated, deceived, and abandoned, the populations of the Vault network broke. The 17 control vaults that functioned without deliberate sabotage mostly produced functioning communities. The difference between those outcomes and the others is simply whether someone with the power to help chose to use it that way. Section 16. The last entries and the long quiet, we are deep now. The kind of deep where the fluorescent lights have been on long enough that you have stopped noticing them, where the recycled air no longer smells recycled, where the hum of the machinery is simply the sound of being alive. This is what the Vault felt like to the people who grew up in one, to the generations who were born and lived and died without ever knowing another environment. The Vault was home. The Vault was the world, and hidden in the infrastructure of that home, in the air systems and the food dispensers and the overseer's private office, was everything that was being done to them. There are a handful of remaining entries worth noting before we close. The Brad Burton Vault at Nuka World is worth a final return because it represents a unique variant on the Vault concept, one where the experiment was not run on a large population but on a single individual, and where that individual's survival was the stated goal rather than a byproduct. John Caleb Bradburton, the founder of the Nuka-Cola Corporation, made a deal with Vault-Tec before the Great War. He would receive the technology to preserve his consciousness, to keep his brain functioning indefinitely in a stasis container, in exchange for Vault-Tec's use of Nuka World for promotional and possibly experimental purposes. Bradburton's head is what remains of that deal, preserved in a glass chamber 200 years after he made it, fully conscious, fully aware of everything that has happened in those 2 centuries, and completely unable to participate in any of it. He has been preserved exactly as promised. The quality of the preservation was simply never specified. The military vaults, specifically Vault 87 and the FE5 program, represent the military dimension of the Vault network that is easy to overlook when focusing on the social experiments. Vault-Tec was a defense contractor. Its relationship with the pre-war military was close and deep. Several vaults appear to have served military research purposes as much as or more than social science purposes, the FEV work being the most clearly military in its orientation, designed to produce super soldiers rather than social data. The overlap between the Vault program and the broader weapons development enterprise of the pre-war military is one of the less fully explored aspects of the lore, but one of the most significant in terms of understanding what the Vault network was for at its deepest institutional level. The White Spring Bunker is not technically a vault in the standard sense. It was a secret government facility designed to house elected officials and senior government personnel during a nuclear emergency, but it shares enough structural features with the Vault network and enough of its history with the Enclave's use of Vault technology that it deserves a mention in any comprehensive accounting. The White Spring is where the Enclave concentrated after the bombs fell, where they continued to run their portion of the government in the certainty that they would eventually re-emerge to reclaim what was theirs. The bunker is, in the Fallout 76 lore, an extraordinarily grim place, a facility full of automated systems still trying to maintain the fiction of a functioning government long after the people it was built to serve have mostly died. The Vault-Tec Among the Stars exhibit at Nuka World was a full-scale demonstration vault designed to the same specifications as the real thing, but open to the public as a promotional installation. Families could walk through a model vault and see exactly what the inside would look like, exactly how the facilities were arranged, exactly what their life would be like in an underground shelter. The exhibit was meant to reassure the public, to make the vault feel familiar and comfortable and safe before the moment when they would be assigned to one. It was in this sense advertising, and like all of Vault-Tec's advertising, it was an incomplete truth, showing the comfortable surfaces of the vault concept without mentioning the experimental parameters that would be activated the moment the doors sealed. Section 17. The People Inside. Individual Stories from the Vault Network. It is easy, when surveying the Vault network at scale, to slip into abstraction. The vaults become categories, the experiments become research parameters, the populations become sample sizes. But every vault contained individuals. Every fluorescent corridor that we can describe in general terms was also someone's specific route from their quarters to their job in the food production section. Every experiment that we can analyze as a social science hypothesis was also the daily lived experience of a specific person who went to sleep and woke up and tried to find meaning in the constraints they had been given. The holotapes and terminal logs that players discover throughout the Fallout games are, in this sense, the most important artifacts in the entire franchise. They are the record of the individuals, not the experiments, not the overseers, not the corporations, but the ordinary people who were sealed inside. And when you read them carefully, when you listen to them attentively, they complicate the broad strokes of the Vault narrative in ways that are both humanizing and heartbreaking. In Vault 101, there is a woman named Ellen Santiago whose terminal entries describe her gradual realization that the vault may never open, and the way she made peace with that possibility while also, quietly, and without announcing it to anyone, maintaining a private journal that functioned as a record of what she wished her life might have included. Ellen became a teacher. She loved her students. The vault was the full extent of her world, and she built something inside it that she was genuinely proud of, and she died inside it, having never been outside, and she left behind entries that are, if you find them, among the most quietly beautiful things in the game. In Vault 92, there is a composer named Anna Holt who documented the deterioration of the Vault's musical community with the precision of someone who knew that what she was witnessing was not ordinary, who could feel something wrong even before she had the vocabulary to name it. Her entries move from professional observations about the declining quality of collaborative work, the arguments that had become routine, the performances that had become erratic, to personal fear as she began to understand that the change was not in the music but in the musicians, that something was happening to all of them, and she was not exempt. Anna Holt was a person who went into a vault because she was told her talent was valuable and her life was worth preserving, and she died in a place that had decided both of those things were useful for entirely different reasons than she believed. In Vault 106, the early terminal logs before the drug dispersal began are particularly striking. The residents of Vault 106 were, by the evidence available, a reasonably functional community in the weeks and months before the psychotropic compounds entered the air supply. They organized work committees. They argued about scheduling. They complained about the food and the lighting and the lack of privacy in the residential quarters in ways that are recognizably and specifically the complaints of real people adjusting to a difficult situation. The logs from after the compounds began are different. The syntax deteriorates. The subjects drift. The entries begin to reference things that are clearly not happening, or not happening the way they are being described. The transition, visible in the record, from normal human frustration to chemically altered unreality, is one of the more affecting pieces of environmental storytelling in the franchise. In Vault 11, the records of the annual sacrifice process, the speeches given by candidates, the voting records, the accounts of what happened in the sacrifice chamber, the private journals of residents who had voted for people they knew, constitute a detailed social history of what systematic institutionalized violence does to the fabric of a community over generations. The people who came to the vault in 2077 were not people who would have voted to send their neighbor to die. They became people who did, because the alternative was unthinkable, and then they lived with what they had done, and their children grew up watching it, and the children's children were born into a world where this was simply the way things worked, where the sacrifice was not an aberration, but the annual rhythm of life, and the cruelty was not the exception, but the normal. What the individual voices from the Vault network tell us, taken together, is that the experiments were not conducted on abstract populations. They were conducted on Ellen Santiago and Anna Holt and the unnamed chemist whose early Vault 106 logs read like a dispatch from a life that was, very briefly, ordinary. The data Vault-Tec collected was extracted from those lives, and the lives were spent in the extraction. That is not hyperbole, it is simply what happened. Section 18. The technology of containment. How the vaults actually worked. We have talked extensively about what happened inside the vaults. It is worth spending some time on the remarkable fact that they functioned at all, that technology sealed in the 2070s managed to sustain human life for periods of 25 years, 50 years, 200 years, in some cases longer. This was not a trivial engineering achievement, and understanding what made it possible gives texture to the experience of living inside. The life support systems of a standard vault were designed with extraordinary redundancy. Air recycling, water purification, food production, power generation. Each critical system had multiple backup configurations and was designed to function at reduced capacity without catastrophic failure. The Vault-Tec PA system's advertising copy, preserved in the lore of several vaults, claimed that the water and life support systems could sustain a vault for over 900 years without failure. Whether this figure was accurate is impossible to verify, given that no vault in the canon has operated for anywhere near that long, but the design philosophy it represents, obsessive, layered redundancy, does appear to be real. The power systems were typically fusion-based, using the pre-war world's mastery of nuclear fusion power that the games take for granted as the energy technology of choice. A fusion generator, in the Fallout universe, is essentially indefinitely reliable if properly maintained, which is why the vaults that did not see catastrophic social collapse could maintain their systems for multiple generations. The maintenance burden varied. Vault 53 was deliberately designed to require constant work, but a properly maintained fusion generator would outlast the human beings living above it. Water purification was handled by a multi-stage recycling system that extracted pure water from the vault's biological waste streams, atmospheric moisture capture, and in some cases from aquifers or underground water tables accessible through drilling that had been built into the vault's foundation. The water chip was a critical component in this system, a processing unit that managed the purification sequence, which is why the chip failure in Vault 13 was existential rather than merely inconvenient. The chip was not redundant. It was the single point of failure in a system otherwise designed to have none. Food production was handled by hydroponic farms, fungal cultivation systems, insect protein generation, and processed nutrient production using stored chemical feedstocks. The Culinary 3000 system could prepare these base materials into recognizable food products, or, in the case of Vault 36, into the nutrient paste that the experiment required. The variety and quality of Vault food was genuinely limited by the available production systems, and the psychological significance of that limitation, the inability to eat for pleasure, the constancy of the same flavors and textures, is something several Vault's personal logs mention, with a frequency that suggests it was a significant quality of life factor, even in Vaults that were not experimenting with food quality. The residential systems, the Simu sun lighting that mimicked natural light cycles, the temperature regulation that maintained comfortable conditions, the sound insulation between residential units, were designed to make the experience of living in an underground facility as comfortable as possible. Simu Sun in particular is a piece of technology that several Vault residents note with genuine gratitude in their logs. The ability to experience something that felt like sunlight, even knowing it was artificial, apparently mattered more than Vault-Tec's researchers might have predicted. The circadian rhythm anchoring it provided, the vitamin D synthesis it supported, the simple pleasure of warm light at the right angle, these things are mentioned repeatedly as making the Vault livable in a way that pure functional adequacy would not have achieved. The Pip-Boy devices that Vault residents received, personal computers worn on the wrist, providing access to Vault information systems, medical monitoring, environmental data, and entertainment, were another significant quality of life element, and one of the more interesting pieces of Vault technology because of how thoroughly it was integrated into the Vault experience. Children in Vaults like Vault 101 received their Pip-Boys at age 10, in a ceremony that functioned as a coming-of-age ritual. The device was not merely a tool, it was a marker of status, a sign of belonging, a piece of technology that connected the individual to the Vault's information infrastructure in a way that was simultaneously practical and symbolic. What all of this technology achieved, ultimately, was a kind of enforced stability. The Vaults were, by design, systems that could maintain themselves in more or less the same condition indefinitely. The food would keep being produced, the water would keep being purified, the lights would keep cycling, the temperature would stay comfortable. This stability was real, and it was valuable, and it is part of why the experiments could run for decades without the simple failure of the physical systems bringing them to an end. The Vaults did not fall apart. They kept going, which meant the people inside kept experiencing whatever had been designed for them to experience, year after year, with the same relentless consistency that the water recyclers and the fusion generators and the Simu Sun lights provided. The technology of containment was, in the end, the technology of the experiment. Without the extraordinary reliability of the Vault's physical systems, none of the social and psychological research could have been sustained at scale. The engineering that kept people alive was the same engineering that kept them trapped. Section 19, The World That Made the Vaults. Pre-war America and the logic of the experiment. The Vault experiments did not emerge from nowhere. They were the product of a specific cultural and political moment, a pre-war America that had developed particular habits of thought about science, about government authority, about the relationship between institutions and the people they were supposed to serve. The Fallout universe's version of pre-war America is a deliberate exaggeration of mid-20th century American culture, pushed to an extreme that reveals the anxieties latent in the original. The consumerism is more extreme. The corporate influence is more overt. The government's willingness to trade individual rights for institutional security is more nakedly expressed. But the elements being exaggerated were real elements of the original, and the Vault experiments, in their logic and their ethics, are recognizable extensions of real research practices. The mid-century United States had a complicated relationship with the ethics of human experimentation. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, enrolled hundreds of black men in Alabama as research subjects without their informed consent, and deliberately withheld treatment from them to observe the natural progression of the disease. The MK Ultra program, running through the 1950s and 60s, administered psychoactive drugs including LSD to unwitting subjects as part of a mind control research program. The radiation experiments conducted on civilian populations in the decades following Hiroshima and Nagasaki exposed people to radioactive materials without their knowledge or consent, in the name of understanding the effects of nuclear exposure. These are not ancient history. These are things that happened in living memory, conducted by institutions that believed the research value justified the ethical cost, authorized by government oversight that either endorsed the research or looked away from it. The Fallout universe's Vault experiments are extreme extensions of this logic, pushed to the limit of plausibility, but the logic itself is not invented. Vault-Tec's researchers, in the fiction, presumably understood themselves the way the researchers in these real programs understood themselves, as scientists engaged in necessary work, studying problems that ordinary research ethics could not address adequately, producing knowledge that justified the methods used to produce it. The data on long-term isolation, the data on population behavior under resource scarcity, the data on FEFEV exposure, the data on subliminal audio manipulation. All of it, in the internal logic of the people who designed the experiments, was worth having, worth the cost. The specific cost being borne by specific people is always the part of this calculation that gets abstracted away. The Vault experiments are, among their many other qualities, a sustained meditation on this abstraction, on the moral distance that institutions create between the people who make decisions and the people who experience the consequences of those decisions, on the ease with which human beings become research subjects when the people responsible for them are organized around a different set of goals than their well-being, on what it means to trust an institution and what that trust enables the institution to do. Section 20, The Legacy in the Wasteland. How the Vaults Shaped Everything. After the story of the Vaults does not end when the doors open. In many ways, it begins there. Begins in the specific ways that people who spent years or generations inside a designed, experimental environment carry that environment with them when they finally emerge into the world. The New California Republic is the most obvious example. Founded by descendants of Vault 15's fragmented population, the NCR is a democratic republic. In a world where democratic republics should be impossible, it has elections, it has a legislature, it has a president, it has citizenship and rights, and a legal system, and an army, and a bureaucracy. It is, by the standards of the post-nuclear world, extraordinary. And it is extraordinary because the people who built it came from a vault where the experimental design had accidentally produced the conditions for democratic governance. A diverse population that had to negotiate its differences across generations, that had developed the institutions and habits of mind that democratic systems require. The NCR has problems, significant ones. Corruption, overextension, the peculiar contradictions of a democratic republic trying to impose its political model on communities that did not choose it. These are real-world problems that democratic republics have always faced, and the NCR faces them in the specific register of the Fallout universe. But the fact that it exists at all, that a recognizable democratic society emerged from the chaos of the post-nuclear world, is traceable directly to one Vault's accidental social experiment. The Brotherhood of Steel is a more complicated legacy, emerging not from a single Vault, but from the general experience of military and technological elites who survived the nuclear exchange through various means, including Vault-adjacent facilities. The Brotherhood's hoarding of technology, its intense insularity, its military hierarchy, and absolute deference to accumulated expertise. These are traits that make perfect sense in the context of a sealed, technological community that has learned to equate survival with information control. The Brotherhood guards what it has. It does not share. It does not extend trust outside its own ranks. These are Vault behaviors, learned in the Vaults and extended outward. The Institute, which appears in Fallout 4, is perhaps the clearest case of a Vault-adjacent community that took the worst lessons of the experimental system and extended them. The Institute lives underground. It controls information absolutely. It treats the surface population as a resource to be managed rather than a community to be engaged. It conducts experiments on people without their knowledge or consent. The parallels to Vault-Tec are deliberate and pointed, and the game does not try to hide them. The Institute's relationship to the Vault system is not just thematic. The Institute descends from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and its early history, preserved in fragmented lore throughout Fallout 4, involves a direct engagement with the Vault network, including the sabotage of Vault 111 that the player character's family was caught in. The people who eventually became the Institute learned their methods partly from observing Vault-Tec, and partly from operating in the same environment that the Vault experiments had created. The post-nuclear world that the Vaults helped produce was, in turn, the environment that shaped the organizations trying to navigate it. The followers of the apocalypse, connected, as noted, to Vault 29, represent a different kind of legacy, a commitment to knowledge, medical care, and human dignity that is genuinely unusual in the Wasteland context, maintained by an organization that has chosen, deliberately, to extend rather than hoard what it knows. The followers distribute medical care, they teach, they preserve libraries. They treat the Wasteland's population not as subjects or resources, but as people who deserve access to what knowledge can offer them. This too is a Vault legacy, but it is the opposite of the Institute's. It is what you get when the people who emerge from an experiment choose to use what they learned about survival and knowledge taken to serve others, rather than to protect themselves. The Vault network was designed to produce data. What it actually produced was every major faction, every major social dynamic, and every major moral question in the Fallout universe. The world above the vaults is, in every meaningful sense, a consequence of what happened below. Section 21, the specific horror of each vault, going deeper. We have covered the broad outlines of many vaults, but there are dimensions of several key entries that deserve more thorough treatment. The franchise has added detail across 30 years of games and supplemental content, and some of that detail illuminates the experiments in ways that the summary descriptions do not fully convey. Vault 92 warrants a longer look because the experiment there is more sophisticated than it first appears. The white noise program was not a simple aggression trigger. According to the notes preserved in the Vault's research terminals, it was designed to operate in phases. The early phase, running for approximately the first 6 months after the Vault sealed, was a calibration period during which the audio content was below the threshold of conscious perception, but was still affecting the residents' stress hormone baseline in measurable ways. The researchers, who were embedded in the Vault population as staff members, presenting themselves as counselors and program administrators, were monitoring these changes and adjusting the audio parameters based on what they observed. The second phase introduced content specifically tuned to the frequency ranges most effective at disrupting serotonin regulation in the human nervous system. The third phase incorporated patterns that the researchers believed would selectively amplify paranoid ideation without producing the kind of gross behavioral changes that would be immediately visible to the broader population. The goal was a slow burn, a gradual increase in baseline anxiety and interpersonal suspicion that would eventually produce a measurable change in the Vault's social dynamics without any obvious trigger event. What they observed instead was that the musicians, people with highly trained auditory systems, people whose professional lives had made them acutely sensitive to subtle variations in sound, began perceiving the white noise program at a conscious level before the general population did. The first reports of something being wrong with the Vault's acoustic environment came from the musicians. The first individuals to show extreme behavioral changes were the ones whose oral sensitivity allowed them to absorb more of the subliminal content at a higher effective dose than was intended. The experiment accelerated past its intended parameters because its subjects were exactly the people least suited to be the subjects of a subliminal audio study. The irony is perfect and terrible. Vault 92 was populated with the people most vulnerable to its specific experimental method, and Vault-Tec apparently did not connect these two facts before they sealed the doors. Vault 11 also rewards closer examination of its timeline. The sacrifice system did not begin on day one. There was a period immediately after the Vault sealed when the population was processing the shock of the nuclear exchange, the grief of being separated from the world they knew, the disorientation of their new environment. The Vault's computer system waited. It did not issue the sacrifice directive until the community had had time to establish itself, to create bonds, to build the social fabric that would make the tearing of that fabric maximally painful. The first sacrifice selection produced results that the computer's designers apparently anticipated, but that the Vault's residents experienced as a complete crisis. The debates that followed the announcement, the arguments about what system should be used, about who could possibly be asked to make this decision, about whether the announcement itself might be false, lasted for months. The first sacrifice was eventually selected through a process that the Vault's historians would later describe as something close to a lottery, a system that no one fully endorsed, but that everyone could live with better than the alternatives. The second year's selection was different. The lottery had made everyone equally vulnerable, and some residents began to understand that if the lottery was the mechanism, the way to protect yourself was to change who had access to the mechanism. Small political organizations formed, each one oriented around the goal of controlling the selection process in a way that protected their own members while directing the selection toward people they could sacrifice without personal cost. By the 5th or 6th year, the Vault's politics had entirely reorganized around the annual sacrifice. Every relationship, every alliance, every conflict was filtered through the question of who would be chosen next and how to ensure it was not you or anyone you cared about. The annual election for overseer, which in most vaults was a governance matter, became in Vault 11 a question of who among the population was most expendable, because whoever held the overseer title at the end of their term was the year's sacrifice. This inverted the dynamics of leadership in a way that eventually produced some of the Vault's most interesting adaptations. Certain individuals began voluntarily nominating themselves for the overseer position, reasoning that the year of authority and resource control it provided was worth the cost at the end of it. Others were pushed into the role against their will by factions who wanted them gone. The overseer chair became simultaneously the most powerful and most dangerous position in the Vault, and the people who occupied it were, by the end, a strange mixture of the truly selfless and the genuinely calculating. The civil war that eventually destroyed most of the Vault's population began over a reform movement, a faction that proposed replacing the sacrifice system with a different allocation mechanism, one that they argued would be fairer and less destructive. The opposing faction, which had spent years building its power within the existing system, resisted the change with the intensity of people who understood that any change to the rules would eliminate the advantages they had accumulated under the current ones. The violence that resulted from this conflict killed far more people than the sacrifice system itself had ever taken. Vault 87 has a particular horror that becomes clear when you understand the timescale of what happened there. The FEV exposure program began within weeks of the Vault sealing. The original population, 1,000 ordinary people who had been selected through Vault-Tec's standard process, who had come to the Vault believing they were being protected, began being taken to the exposure chambers almost immediately. The speed of the program's implementation was necessary because the Enclave's research timeline required data within a specific window. The residents of Vault 87 were not told what was happening to them. They were told a variety of things, depending on what the overseer and staff judged most likely to produce compliance. Some were told it was a medical procedure, a series of inoculations against radiation exposure. Some were told it was a fitness assessment. Some were simply taken by the Vault's security personnel and not given any explanation at all. The transformation process was rapid by the standards of biological change, but slow by the standards of human endurance. The FEV variant used in Vault 87 produced its effects over a period of days and weeks, during which the subjects were changed at a cellular level in ways that were, for much of the process, visibly apparent. The accounts that would eventually surface in the Vault's terminal logs, the ones written by staff members who themselves were not scheduled for exposure, at least not initially, described the deterioration with a clinical detachment that, reading between the lines, was clearly a coping mechanism. The supermutants that emerged from Vault 87 retained enough cognitive function to maintain basic social organization, but they had lost, along with their human bodies, most of the specific memories and relationships that had defined them as individuals. The person who had come to the Vault with a family, with a history, with a set of skills and preferences and private thoughts, that person was still present in some attenuated form, buried beneath the biology of what they had become, but they could no longer access most of what had made them who they were. The Vault's original population was gone within the first generation of the FEV program. What replaced them was a group of supermutants who knew, in some vague way, that this place was where they had come from, but could not reconstruct the specific history of that origin in any detail. They continued to operate the Vault systems, not because they understood the original purpose of those systems, but because the infrastructure of the Vault was simply the environment they lived in, and keeping it running was the practical necessity that organized their existence. Vault 106's drug program had a quality that distinguishes it from most of the other chemical experiments in the network. It was permanent. There was no intended endpoint to the psychotropic dispersal. The compounds were released continuously from the moment they were activated, with no schedule for reduction or cessation. The experiment was not designed to study what happened when a population was exposed to psychoactive substances for a defined period and then returned to baseline. It was designed to study what happened when a population was exposed indefinitely, what the stable endpoint looked like, what kind of community and what kind of individuals developed when the chemical alteration was simply the constant background condition of existence. This is a genuinely unusual experimental design even by the Vault's unethical standards, because most experiments, however cruel, have an implied end state, a point at which enough data has been collected, or the population has reached an outcome that answers the research question. Vault 106's experiment had no natural endpoint. It would simply have continued until either the chemical supply ran out or the vault's systems failed. The population that the player character encounters in Fallout 3 is, in this sense, the study's result. A community that has been living in a chemically altered state for 200 years, whose baseline is the altered state, whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were born into that state and have never known another. The compounds have not made them feral in the way that radiation sometimes makes ghouls feral. They are organized, they are purposeful, they are hostile to intruders in a way that suggests social coordination rather than pure biological aggression. But the cognition and perception that organize their behavior are not the cognition and perception of an unaltered human being. The experiment is not over. It has simply produced its result, and the result is still walking the corridors. Vault 112's virtual reality system was a technological achievement that, in a different context, might have been genuinely transformative. The ability to create fully immersive virtual environments indistinguishable from reality. Environments that could provide rich experience, meaningful social interaction, and genuine aesthetic pleasure to people confined in a physically limited space, was exactly the kind of technology that Vaults needed and that Vault-Tec's research division had been working toward. Stanislaus Braun, who developed the Tranquility Lane system, was a genuine technical genius. The fact that he chose to use his creation as a vehicle for 2 centuries of systematic sadism does not diminish the achievement of what he built. It makes the achievement more terrible in the way that all genuinely great capabilities in the hands of genuinely terrible people are more terrible than lesser capabilities would be. The specific cruelties that Braun engineered in Tranquility Lane are documented, if you find the right terminals and listen to the right holotapes. They are not things that most people would want to dwell on. What is worth noting is the structure of what he did. The memory wipes between scenarios that prevented the residents from accumulating a continuous experience of what was happening to them. The way each new scenario began from what appeared to be a fresh state. The manner in which Braun preserved the appearance of an ordinary neighborhood life, as the frame through which extraordinary acts of cruelty were delivered. The memory erasure is, in some ways, the most disturbing element. The residents of Vault 112 were not conscious of living in a torture scenario in the way that would allow them to psychologically adapt or resist or even fully process what was happening to them. Each iteration of the program began fresh, their sense of it being normal life intact, their previous experiences erased. They were, in a very specific technical sense, suffering without continuity, experiencing horrors that they could not contextualize because the context had been deleted. They were trapped not just in the experience but in the absence of the framework that would allow the experience to mean something. Braun, who had given himself a cheerful little girl avatar named Betty, watched all of this with the sustained attention of someone who had found his life's purpose. 200 years of sustained attention. It is worth letting the scale of that sit for a moment. Not a decade, not a lifetime. 200 years of arriving each day at the same project, refining it, elaborating it, finding new variations, discovering new capacities in the technology and in himself. What kind of person does that make you at the end of 200 years? What remains? The game gives us Betty, bright, cheerful, genuinely delighted by the arrival of a new playmate, and leaves the question largely unanswered, which is, in its own way, an answer. Section 22, the philosophical architecture of the Vault universe. There is a question the Fallout franchise has been asking, in various registers and with various degrees of directness, since the original game in 1997. It is not quite a question about nuclear war, or about corporate malfeasance, or even about human nature in the abstract. It is a question about the relationship between power and ethics, about what happens to the moral sense when it is insulated from consequence. The Vault experiments are the franchise's most elaborate exploration of this question. Vault-Tec and the Enclave were not organizations that operated without ethical frameworks. They had them. The researchers who designed the experiments wrote research protocols and submitted them to oversight committees and used the language of scientific necessity to describe what they were doing. The overseers who implemented the experiments were not simply given permission to do anything they wanted. They were given specific directives, specific parameters, specific goals. The entire enterprise was organized, documented, and justified. The ethical frameworks they used were simply not ones that extended moral consideration to the people inside the vaults. The residents were subjects. The categories used to evaluate the ethical quality of the research did not include their well-being, except as a variable to be managed in service of the research's integrity. A subject who is dead cannot produce data. Beyond that practical constraint, there was essentially no limit on what the research could require. This is, as noted earlier, not entirely unlike the real research ethics failures of the 20th century, but the Vault experiments push the logic further, and they do so in a way that illuminates something about the structure of the failure. The moral exclusion of the Vault residents was not primarily a product of particular individuals' cruelty. It was a product of institutional logic. The vaults were designed to be sealed. The residents were designed to have no contact with the outside world. The researchers were designed to have authority over their subjects and no external accountability for how they exercised it. When you remove external accountability from institutional power, you do not necessarily get sadism. You get drift. You get the gradual, almost imperceptible movement of standards in the direction that benefits the institution and away from the direction that costs it. You get research protocols that would have been unthinkable at the outset becoming normal over years of implementation. You get Braun's little girl avatar and 200 years of accumulated darkness that began probably with something much smaller. The Vault experiments are a horror story about what sealed environments do to people, not just to the residents who are trapped inside them, but to the administrators who are insulated within them. The overseers who became monsters were not monsters when they started. They were people given absolute authority in the absence of any accountability mechanism, and they discovered what that combination produces. The question the franchise poses through all of it is whether this is an aberration or a law, whether the results of the Vault experiments represent the outcome of specific unusual circumstances, or whether they reveal something about power that applies broadly to sealed environments of all kinds, to any structure that combines authority with insulation and calls it science. The Fallout universe does not answer this question directly. It just builds vault after vault, experiment after experiment, outcome after outcome, and lets you sit with the accumulation. Section 23, The Community as Survivor. What remains? Beyond the stories of individual vaults, there is a story about the broader community of vault survivors and their descendants. The population of the post-nuclear world that traces some portion of its lineage, its culture, its values, and its problems to the sealed corridors of the Vault network. Vault survivors, where they appear in the games, often carry a particular signature. There is something about the Vault experience. The specific combination of institutional dependence, sealed environment, and controlled information that shapes people in recognizable ways even after they have left. The wariness about institutions, the attachment to familiar objects and routines that were the anchors of Vault life. The particular kind of social anxiety that comes from having spent formative years in an environment where every relationship was managed and every resource was dispensed by a central authority. Vault 101's residents, as depicted in Fallout 3, are a particularly clear case. The people who emerge from the Vault during the game's events have spent their entire lives in a sealed environment where the Overseer's word was literally law, and the outside world was both feared and forbidden. When they emerge, either voluntarily in the game's narrative or in the ending where the Vault is fully opened, they are not simply displaced people finding their footing in a new environment. They are people for whom the most basic assumptions about how the world works no longer apply. The authority that organized their lives is gone. The walls that define their world are behind them. The familiar sounds and smells and light levels of their entire lived experience are no longer present. The adjustment required is not primarily practical. Most Vault dwellers have the technical skills to survive in the Wasteland. They know chemistry, they know mechanics, they know medical care, they know how to farm and recycle and maintain equipment. The practical skills of Vault life are broadly applicable. What they lack is the psychological infrastructure for freedom, the ability to make decisions without reference to an authority structure, the comfort with uncertainty that surviving in the Wasteland requires, the trust in other people that building communities beyond Vault walls demands, a trust that the Vault system, with its managed relationships and institutional mediation of conflict, did not develop in its residents. The communities that Vault survivors build in the Wasteland often reflect these lacunae. They tend toward hierarchy. they tend toward information control. They tend toward the replication of vault-like structures, overseers who become leaders, resource management systems that centralize authority over food and water and medicine, social rules that echo the institutionalized life they came from. Sometimes this is functional. Vault City, with its orderly society and advanced medical care, is a vault culture successfully transplanted to the surface. Sometimes it is catastrophic. Communities that adopt the power structures of the vault without the material stability of the vault tend to develop the worst features of both systems. What does not replicate as cleanly is the vault's material reliability. In the Wasteland, things break, resources are uncertain, external threats are real and not manageable through institutional authority alone. The vault survivors who thrive are the ones who can adapt the community-building instincts of their vault upbringing to conditions that the vault did not prepare them for. The ones who can maintain the social trust that organized life requires while developing the flexibility and risk tolerance that the Wasteland demands. The ones who fail, often, are the ones who keep trying to recreate the vault above ground, who keep trying to seal the doors, control the information, manage the population, maintain the fiction that everything can be controlled. The Wasteland does not allow sealed environments. Things come in, things go out. The vault was sustainable precisely because it was completely closed. Once you open the door, you cannot pretend you are still inside. Section 24. Every number accounted for. The complete census. Census take one final pass through the complete inventory of known and speculated vault numbers, organized in a way that treats the gaps as meaningful rather than incidental. The vault network ran from Vault 0 through at least Vault 118. Within that range, 122 vaults were constructed according to the lore. The specific locations of many of these facilities were never documented in publicly accessible materials. The vault map shown in various contexts accounts for roughly that number of dots across the continental United States. But the dots are not individually labeled in most versions. What we know is distributed across the games, the Fallout Bible, the TV series, and various supplemental materials. Starting from the beginning, the Los Angeles Proof of Concept Vault, sometimes referred to as Vault 0 in certain materials, sometimes as simply the Demonstration Vault, was built first, before the numbered series, and served as the public face of the Vault program. It was open for tours. Citizens could walk through it. It was, more than any other installation, responsible for the public enthusiasm that made the program politically viable. And it was, presumably, the cleanest version of the Vault concept, the showroom model with no experimental parameters and no hidden agenda, just the facilities, as advertised, working as intended. After the Demonstration Vault, the numbered installations were built in a sequence that does not correspond perfectly to numerical order. Construction was happening simultaneously at multiple sites, prioritized by geographic and logistical factors rather than sequential numbering. The earliest numbered vaults were concentrated in California and the Southwest, near the corporate headquarters and the established construction infrastructure. Later installations spread across the country as the program expanded. Among the vaults we have not addressed or have addressed only briefly, Vault 1 through Vault 7 represent an early cluster whose specifics are almost entirely undocumented. The Fallout Bible and subsequent materials reference numbers in this range without filling in their experimental parameters, locations, or outcomes. These are, in the lore, essentially blank slates, vaults that were built, that were sealed on or before October 23, 2077, and whose histories are simply not available, whether they were experimental or control vaults, whether their populations survived, whether they produced anything that influenced the Wasteland in documented ways. None of this is established. Vault 14 is similarly undocumented. Its location, population, and experimental status are unknown. It falls in the numerical range that suggests early construction, probably in the California Southwest cluster, but nothing has been definitively established. Vault 16 is a blank. Vault 18 is primarily a mod location, significant in the Fallout. New California fan project, but not formally canonical. Vault 20 is undocumented, as are Vaults 23, 25, 26, and 28. Vault 30 through Vault 35 skip between the documentary record. 31, 32, and 33 are fully documented through the TV series. 34 is the Mojave Weapons Vault. 35 is unknown. Vault 37 through Vault 41 are gaps. Vault 39 appears in Van Buren design documents as a location with some significance, but the specifics have not been canonically established. Vault 44 through Vault 50 are largely undocumented, with some references in various materials to numbers in this range that do not provide enough detail to characterize the installations. Vault 52 is unknown. Vault 54 is unknown. The numbers between the Fallout Bible entries, 53, 55, 56, and Vault 63 in Appalachia are mostly empty. Vaults 57, 58, 59. The Project Safehouse materials that appear in the New California mod suggest specific experiments for some of these, but the canonical status of those materials is not officially established. Vault 60, 61, 62. The New California materials describe 60 as a flooding experiment. Lower levels begin filling with water after day 10, rising by a foot per day, and 62 as an overseer experiment with absolute authority over vault populations. These details exist in a gray zone between fan canon and official lore, but reflect the general flavor of vault experimental design. Vaults 64 through 67 are blanks. Vaults 71 through 74 are blanks. Vault 78 is undocumented. Vaults 80 through 86 are largely unknown, though 82 and 83 appear in some supplemental materials in contexts that are not clearly canonical. Vaults 89 through 91 are unknown. Vault 93 is unknown. Vaults 97 through 100 are unknown. Vaults 102 through 105 are unknown. Vault 107 and Vault 110 are unknown. Vaults 115 through 117 are unknown. Vault 119 and any installations above it are either undocumented or too recently added to the canon to be thoroughly established. The gaps are not random. They are the spaces into which future Fallout games, future seasons of the TV series, future supplemental materials, and future creative decisions can be inserted. The Fallout universe has been building a deliberate reserve of blank vault numbers, holding them in potential, available for any story that needs an underground setting with a history and a population, and an experiment that has been running for 2 centuries. Each blank number is an unopened door. Final section, what echoes 200 years on, the vault doors have mostly opened. Most have opened to tragedy, doors coming apart in the hands of survivors who found they had emerged into a world that was not ready for them, or that was too ready in the wrong ways, that had developed new hierarchies and new dangers while the people inside were sealed away from it. Some opened to silence, nothing on the other side but empty air and distance. A few opened to something that felt, tentatively and carefully and with appropriate suspicion, like possibility. The Fallout universe does not end at the vault door. The games, the series, the 2.5 decades of storytelling that have grown around this franchise all continue into the Wasteland, into the lives that former Vault dwellers and the children of former Vault dwellers and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of former Vault dwellers have built out there in the world that Vault-Tec helped end. The factions that define the franchise, the Brotherhood of Steel, the New California Republic, the Institute, the Enclave, the Railroad, all of them, in one way or another, carry DNA from the vaults. They are shaped by what happened underground, and by what those who survived underground went looking for when they finally emerged. The NCR carries Vault 15's chaotic idealism. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland carry Vault 87's horror. The followers of the Apocalypse carry Vault 29's quiet hope. The underground world that Vault-Tec built did not stay underground. It seeped out, the way everything seeps out eventually, the way the radiation from Vault 12's faulty door seeped into the flesh of the residents who became the ghouls of Necropolis. It got into everything. The Railroad, the faction in Fallout 4 dedicated to liberating synthetic humans and helping them escape the Institute, carries a particular vault resonance that is worth noting. The Railroad's operatives are people who have chosen to extend moral consideration to beings that the dominant institutions of their world have decided are not fully people. They are, in this sense, doing exactly what the Vault experiment's ethical framework refused to do. They are asking whether the beings in their care have an interior life that matters, and answering yes, regardless of institutional consensus. The Railroad exists in the same world that the Vaults created, and it is organized around the rejection of the same logic that made the Vaults possible. The Minutemen, in Fallout 4, are a different kind of vault legacy, not connected to any specific vault, but representing the general project of community building that surviving populations attempt when the institutional frameworks they inherited break down. The Minutemen are fundamentally about voluntary association, about people choosing to protect each other because they have decided that is worth doing, without the coercion of an overseer or the closed system of a vault to enforce the arrangement. They are fragile, underfunded, and chronically disorganized. They are also, in the context of the Commonwealth, one of the most genuinely hopeful forces in the game, because what they are trying to do is what the vaults were supposedly trying to enable, approached with the honesty of people who know the cost. What the Vault experiments ultimately produced was not the data Vault-Tec or the Enclave hoped to collect. It was not a clean record of human behavioral patterns under controlled conditions, a research database that could be used to engineer a better society. The data, to whatever extent it was collected at all, was collected by an organization that was itself destroyed in the nuclear exchange it had planned for. The Enclave's oil rig facility was destroyed in Fallout 2. The broader Enclave presence in the capital Wasteland was destroyed in Fallout 3. The researchers who designed the experiments mostly did not survive to analyze the results. What the Vault experiments actually produced was the Wasteland itself. The people who walked out of those doors, changed by what had happened to them, shaped by the specific pressures and absences and cruelties that had been built into their environments, went out into the world and built what they could with what they had. Some built empires, some built families, some built communities of genuine decency in the wreckage of everything. Some fell apart entirely, victims not of the bombs, but of the things that had been done to them in the sealed places beneath the earth. And some of what they built was beautiful. The settlements of the Wasteland, the rebuilt towns and trading posts and medical clinics and libraries and farms, are all, in some sense, reconstructions. Attempts to recreate, under worse conditions and with fewer resources, something of what existed before. The people doing the reconstructing are mostly not people who remember the before. They are descendants, working from stories and from ruins and from the specific inheritances their vaults gave them, building what they can imagine. The specific things they can imagine are shaped by the specific experiences that shape them. The children of Vault 29's children imagine a world where knowledge is shared freely and care is extended without hierarchy. The descendants of Vault 15's competing factions imagine a world organized around the principles that their particular faction carried through the generations. The survivors of Vault 21 imagine a world where a fair game is the best justice available, and they build their casino from that imagination. This is the story that the Fallout franchise keeps returning to, in game after game and season after season. Not the story of the bombs, which were over in an afternoon, but the story of what the sealed places did to the people who trusted them, and what those people did after the doors finally opened, with everything they had survived. The vaults are behind them. The vaults are in the walls they build, and the rules they make, and the fears they carry, and the hopes they sometimes allow themselves, despite everything. The experiment never fully ends. In the real world, the question that the Fallout franchise asks through its vault lore is one we live with too. What are the sealed environments in our own culture? What are the systems that separate the people who make decisions from the people who live with those decisions, that insulate institutional power from accountability, that treat some populations as subjects whose experiences are data points rather than lives? The vaults are science fiction. The logic of the vaults is not. The franchise is, at its best, not simply asking us to marvel at how dark things can get. It is asking us to recognize the conditions that produce the darkness, the deference to institutional authority, the acceptance of information asymmetry, the willingness to treat the suffering of people we do not see as an acceptable cost of systems we benefit from. These are not features of a dystopian future. They are features of the world that produced the fiction. There are 122 vaults. Most of them are still out there in the fiction of the Fallout universe, sealed or partially collapsed or reclaimed by the Wasteland, holding in their corridors and their terminal logs and their holotapes the specific residue of what happened inside. Some have been found, most have not. The ones that have been found have given us the stories in this script, the experiments and the outcomes and the individual voices that cried out from the data. The ones that have not been found are still there, waiting in the dark, containing whatever Vault-Tec put in them 200 years ago, and whatever the people inside made of it since. Their doors are still sealed, or their doors have been open for a century and no one has been through them yet, or their doors fell apart decades ago, and what is left inside has been open to the wasteland's weather and wanderers and wildlife long enough that the human story has been almost entirely replaced by something else. There is something oddly peaceful, in the end, about going through all of this, about sitting with the Vault network as a whole and understanding what it was and what it became. The fluorescent hum is consistent throughout. The recycled air smells the same in every vault. The Simu sunlight cycles through its artificial dawn and noon and dusk with perfect regularity, regardless of what is happening in the corridors below it. The machinery keeps running. The water keeps cycling. The fusion generators keep generating. The vaults were built to last, and they did. Most of them lasted long past the point where lasting was serving anyone's interest. Long past the point where the experiment was generating useful data. Long past the point where the people inside them could reasonably be said to be living lives. And yet they kept going, because that is what sealed systems do. They maintain their conditions. They sustain whatever they were built to sustain, past the point of any external rationale for the sustaining. The vaults kept going because vaults keep going. The experiment kept running because no one in a position of authority made a decision to stop it. The door stayed closed because no one with a key chose to open it. This is one of the quietest and most persistent observations in the entire franchise, that the vault doors did not open themselves. Every vault that was eventually opened because a specific person made a specific decision to open it. The Vault Dweller in Fallout 1, the Lone Wanderer's father in Fallout 3, the sole survivor in Fallout 4, the 5 survivors of Vault 11, 11 who said no, the one person who breaks the seal, who decides the outside is worth the risk, who chooses the unknown over the managed darkness. The doors need someone to open them. That is enough for now. If you made it this far, thank you for being here, genuinely. Drop a like if this helped you settle in for the night, and subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep lore content to fall asleep to. Leave a comment telling me which vault stayed with you, which experiment you are still thinking about, which door you would be most afraid to find or already open. I read all of them, and they make this worth making. Sleep well, the fluorescent lights are still on, the recycled air still smells like recycled air, the machinery is still running. You are safe. Probably. A final note on the sources. Everything covered in this script is drawn from official Fallout lore across the game series. Fallout 1 and 2, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4 and its DLC content, Fallout 76 and the Prime Video television series. The Fallout Bible, compiled by Tim Kaine and Chris Avallone, fills in vault details not directly playable in the games. Where information comes from that supplemental source or from the TV series exclusively, it has been noted. Where details derive from fan-produced materials of uncertain canonical status, the New California mod, design documents for the canceled Van Buren project. This has also been noted. Any vault number for which no information was available in these sources has been labeled as undocumented rather than invented. The franchise has consistently left the majority of its vault numbers as open entries, and speculating about their contents without a canonical basis would be doing a disservice to the actual lore, which is already extensive enough to support several hours of careful discussion. The Vault experiments are one of the great pieces of world-building in gaming history. Not because they are fun to experience exactly, most of them are profoundly uncomfortable, but because of the density of thought and imagination that went into creating them, and because of what they reveal about the series' underlying concerns. The people at Interplay who first developed the Vault concept in 1997, and the teams at Bethesda, Obsidian, and the television production who have extended it since, built something that rewards attention. Every additional layer of detail reveals something new. Every new vault adds to the sense of a complete, terrible, fully realized world underground. That world is worth knowing, even in the dark, especially in the dark.